Hey everyone, today we are doing something a little different on Empire. You've all heard Santiago and me talk a lot about the US Treasury sanctions on Tornado Cash last week that sent ripple effects across crypto from GitHub to Circle to a Tornado developer being arrested in the Netherlands and Fura Alchemy DeFi front ends censored related addresses. Now there is a heated debate to figure out if Ethereum can remain censorship resistant. Well, Jill, Gunter, and Michael Mosier from Espresso Systems hosted an epic Twitter space called Your Privacy, Risks, and Rights following Tornado Cash sanctions on these exact topics. Jill is a good friend, longtime friend of Blockworks. We've teamed up to get the recording out to a wider audience. It's a massive episode. It's almost 3 hours, but it's full of deep insights. It has an all-star lineup. There were like 15 to 20 people who joined the conversation. Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, even makes an appearance. I highly recommend this episode. It gets a little technical if you want to learn more about the recent sanctions and where regulation is headed next. If not, all good, no worries. We'll see you next time for Friday's Roundup.
I'm gonna skip here to Michael, who is I'm calling him my co-host, but that's only because I set up the actual Twitter space here. I think that he is the true host of this event. Michael, if you want to introduce yourself and then kind of formally kick us off here, I think that we've got critical mass, and I'm going to keep pulling people up onto the stage as we go.
Thanks, Jill. That's awesome. I am definitely not anything other than a old nerd from the regulatory space. So I'm really just here to try to help get any sort of level setting on the regulatory space and the legal space, coming from justice and from Treasury at both FinCEN and sometime at OFAC as well, on just sort of how sanctions have worked in the past and not worked, and some of the ways that they've been treated, and why this is, I think, in many ways an exceptional case. And also to help, to the extent that I can, like, focus what I think should be the appropriate urgency, and if there's other things that maybe might not be the concerns as much people think, like some of the criminal enforcement may not be how it really works, to talk through that. But I do think it's a really exceptional case, and I say that from having worked on these cases, and does raise concerns to me, but I think there's a lot of great perspectives here to talk through. So I'll let me just say a couple quick things and then turn it over. But I think one of the key things here for me is just that this is it's not the first mixer that's ever been designated by OFAC. Blender.io was designated back in May of this year, but it's different and in a pretty meaningful way, which is that was a centralized custodial service, and and there was an organization named, an organization that can appeal, that can make changes if it needs to get off the list, all that sort of stuff. And here it's just code, and I think that raises some really, really unique legal and policy issues that have not been worked through yet. I think there's probably some legal questions too of how a code as a person is defined in the executive order, but we can go down that rabbit hole if people really want to. And then I think lastly, in these situations, in a traditional case, you would have extensive analysis of the collateral impacts of a designation. And like in a bank situation, there would be guidance and general licenses to help people wind down and pay mortgages, all that sort of thing. And that hasn't happened here yet. So I think that might be something that we want to get to immediately, and get sort of guidance out there, even while working through hey, wait, is this really the route we want to go, that we're designating code, which I think even the executive order didn't contemplate. But let me get out of the way and then speak when wanted on something specific. And I thought it might be really helpful to, I think Ari Redboard's here from TRM. And before we get into some of the other sort of superstars like Rebecca Reddick that can help talk through some of the collateral impact pieces further, I thought Ari could maybe just give us a quick level set on things like, when we talk about these cases, it's like, well, that's a really extraordinary, blunt authority to use on something that isn't entirely illicit by any means. Like, forget about even the code piece, even if it was our bank. And I think helping us level set for a minute on, like, okay, what are they really seeing? Like, what percentage of this really was identifiably illicit, that sort of thing.
Michael, thank you so much. This is Ari Redboard, and really just incredibly honored to join this group. Not just the speakers, but looking at this list, I'm a little overwhelmed and slightly nervous to be addressing a crowd of subject matter experts at this level on this topic. People like Rebecca and Jay and Michael and Dante. These are the people that I've looked to for guidance as I've tried to navigate this space over the last several years. Look, just like Michael said, like hopefully a little level setting and maybe giving you a little feel of how Treasury was sort of thinking about this from my time as a prosecutor at DOJ, and then from my time at in the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. Look, I think that Michael used the term over and over, exceptional, and I think this really is truly an exceptional designation for a number of reasons. First, really the size and scale is unprecedented. I think what we've seen over the last few years really is really targeted sanctions, enforcement actions, and criminal prosecutions in the crypto space to go after very, very specific actors. So when you're thinking about mixing services, really, the helixes, right, and the Bitcoin fogs of the world, let's call them sort of the darknet advertising mixers, right? They were charged criminally with conspiring with darknet markets to launder funds because they were advertising as a service to essentially do just that. You then see sort of OFAC use authorities to go after what I'd call sort of non-compliant exchanges in Russia in particular, like Suex and Chadex and Garantex. You see them go after darknet markets like Hydra, Alpha Bay, and the intent there is always to sort of take out the illicit actors that are really that are essentially making the overall crypto ecosystem vulnerable as we're trying to build. This is different, right? This is different because while there was a large amount of illicit activity flowing through Tornado Cash, I think somewhere probably in the 30 to 40% category, depending on sort of who you ask, there was also a lot of licit activity. And I think we see that sort of playing out over the last few days in terms of the collateral damage. Just before I sort of hand things over, because there's just some really extraordinary privacy law experts that we want to hear from sort of on those on that side of the house. But to give you sort of a feel for, I think, how Treasury was really looking at this, Michael mentioned, Ronin, the attack on Ronin was really, in my mind, a watershed moment. We keep using that term, but everything is new, right, in crypto. And as we sort of, think about these types of issues. And I think it really changed the perspective on what hacks were, right? Hacks have always been sort of a bad thing. People lose money. People can lose their life savings. It could result in the death of a small business. But when we saw Ronin, and it was perpetrated by North Korea cyber criminals, I think the idea was, hey, look, hacks are not just a criminal issue to be looked at by the FBI and investigated. These are a national security issue because those funds are being used not to live a certain lifestyle, by a hacker, but to fund weapons proliferation and destabilizing activity. And I think that is that has been the focus, at least since Ronin, probably before, from Treasury when it's thinking about hacks. And I think we saw that play out, particularly in Ronin. When I was at Treasury for a number of years, designations of any type of business, a financial institution or anywhere else, could take months, even potentially longer. But what we saw really almost in real time is Treasury start to use blockchain analytics tools to follow the flow of funds. So, once they realized that it was associated, that the original wallet address was associated with North Korea, they immediately designated that the first ever wallet address associated with Lazarus Group. And then when those funds moved, they sanctioned 3 additional addresses. And then finally, sort of, you watch those funds go into Blender. And as Michael mentioned, they designated Blender. And I think what happened really next is the world sort of said, well, they're using Blender, but Tornado Cash has been the go-to laundering service or the go-to sort of mixer for North Korea. According to some work we did at TRM, we have associated it with the top 10 largest hacks from DPRK. If you're sort of looking to check out a little bit more on this, the Center for New American Security, CNAS, did an excellent report on sort of the pre-Ronin hacks. And we at TRM traced the funds in those hacks for the report, but it really sort of is a detailed account of how North Korea uses mixers to launder funds. So really, I think that is where Treasury was focused. And it took some time, certainly, a few weeks after the Blender designation, maybe a little bit more actually at this point. That was in May. And I think it was because they were trying to figure out how to sanction a crypto business entity software. We'll get into that, I know, later, at the size and scale of Tornado Cash. So I think, look, I think Ronin really moved things from a financial crime issue when it came to hacks to a national security issue, and that's the perspective here. And I'm gonna end now, other than to say this: look, the conversation we're having today is just sort of, look, at least since 9/11, we've been having this conversation in the national security space about privacy and security. And really, as the world sort of moves into this digital battlefield, if you will, or this digital space, these conversations are happening on blockchains. And this is really, I think, the first in many respects of those conversations. And it's extraordinary to have the group that we have today having it. So Michael, Jill, thank you so much for having me, and looking forward to engaging in this conversation.
Thanks so much, Ari. Yeah, and I'll turn it over in just 1 second. I think that's such a helpful perspective. And I do want to note like how exceptional this is in that sense of, even if you're looking at on the high end 40% illicit activity, that's still 60% with an enormous number of people with exceptionally legitimate use who are now frozen in many ways, and beyond just the money that might have come from there, it's whole wallets that are sort of indefinitely tainted to a degree, and I think that's the sort of collateral impact that is not just exceptional because it's in the blockchain space, but it is because it's not a person. There's not an entity or organization to engage and say, how do we handle this? Oh, by the way, there's going to be people that have to pay mortgages. Can we get a license to wind that down? There should be, in a bank situation, there would be people on planes overnight landing in the country trying to work through that sort of thing and getting general licenses out there that would authorize people whether they have to file blocking reports or not, and making clarity. And that's the sort of thing that I think we want to happen in the immediate term, but certainly the more definitive long term is, how did we move from people and organizations to a thing, which is code, which whether it's privacy or whether it's First Amendment or whether it's just the fact that there's no person here that can adjust and advocate for people other than all of this group, which is phenomenal. But it's exceptional, and I do think that collateral impact piece is bigger when there isn't a centralized actor. So I think I want to turn it over to Rebecca Rettig, because she's done some phenomenal work looking at this and talking through the sort of collateral impact that I think we want to channel some of this collective energy towards Treasury and the government to sort of see how we can rectify this as fast as possible. Rebecca?
Thanks so much, Michael. And I will say it is certainly daunting both to go after you and Ari, who have done so much work on the ground with your governance experience, and also with the group of people, not just speaking, but also listening in, who have both been incredibly active on this issue since Monday, but also have been active for years in defending crypto from a regulatory and political perspective. So for everybody here who's been doing that, whether publicly or behind the scenes, I will thank you for your work. I have been doing that as well, but I will say I'll try to bridge between software developer perspective and, government and regulatory perspective as well, because I do a lot of that in my day-to-day work. Because we obviously, for people who don't know, I'm general counsel of the Aave companies. We build blockchain-based software for the Web3 world, and we've built one of the largest blue chip DeFi protocols. And we think a lot about compliance, and we understand that regulation and some form of, understandable consumer protection and similar type of rules to what we see in the traditional, financial world may have to have some application, albeit in a new way, to the technology we're building. But this designation on Monday by OFAC of a piece of software is, as both Michael and Ari said, totally unprecedented, and it has a lot of ripple effects, I will say, and I'm sure everyone's seen on Twitter and from people they talk to in their day-to-day life, that software developers themselves are very concerned about what this means from a long-term perspective. I think to talk about the difference between Blender and Tornado Cash, one of the most important things to highlight, as Michael said, is, Blender, and I believe Ari said this too, Blender was centralized. It basically had a group of people behind it who made decisions, who handled the transactions. And as Mike and I have talked about this week, that's similar to having a group of people facilitating illicit or the proceeds of illicit activity through a bank. And those types of banks have seen sanctions. So there's some type of precedence for that. One of the most interesting things about Tornado Cash, in addition to the fact that it is solely autonomous code, is that there is no administrative key. So an admin key, for those who may not know, although I am sure there is a large group of very crypto savvy individuals on here, is a piece of the code that allows for changes to the code, in some ways gives control over the underlying piece of software. A lot of DeFi protocols have admin keys, many of which are held by governance or by a DAO, but other types of code do not, which makes it there absolutely no point of centralization. And so while there was a DAO associated with Tornado Cash, it was not a DAO that could anyway change, modify, control the code in the way that you'd expect, or in any way that brought people making decisions about which transactions to push through or not. So I think that's really important to remember and to make sure we keep, a narrative pushing forward as well. We can talk about the Torn governance tokens and what they allow people to do and not to do sort of later, if that's a topic everyone wants to get into. I actually think that's very interesting because the press release that came out on the sanctions talked about ownership of Tornado Cash. And so there are definitely Torn token holders out there who are thinking about whether that means they are an owner of the protocol. I'd argue no, but I'm sure that very smart minds can differ on that. But I also think the collateral consequences that Mike mentioned is really important. And I'll stop talking after that, but happy to answer questions or, talk about anything anybody is interested in. But the collateral consequences are things that I think both Mike and Ari sort of started to allude to, but there are a number of different consequences that go to the 60%. I would actually argue it's more than 60%. I think there's been some double counting and some potential overinflation of numbers. But putting that aside, let's say at the low end, it's 60% licit activity. A lot of that went to putting people's salaries and salaries of people who may live in countries where you're targeted for receiving money and people want to protect themselves. People's salaries have been stopped and hundreds of thousands of dollars of salaries haven't been paid, both because they usually ran through Tornado Cash or they previously ran through Tornado Cash. So a lot of times companies would run, types of salaries that they were going to pay through Tornado Cash to ensure that it couldn't be tracked to their developers and the like, for no other reason than just financial privacy. Things we pride ourselves on when we're using cash, or even, using banks and things like that, where we expect to have some form of financial privacy. I think the other thing, and a very serious unintended consequences, is that, as far as I understand it, the Ethereum to staker contracts were run through Tornado Cash when they were deployed. And so when we're thinking about, so that means that the future of proof of stake and Ethereum has now touched a sanctioned piece of software in the United States. Now that happened, I think, something like 667 days ago. So well before there was ever a sanction, probably even contemplated. But so it's very different. But the way that blockchain analytics tools work today, and I know companies like TRM and others are working to make sure they update and really make their tools even more user-friendly. And we are big fans of TRM and think they do great work. But, a lot of times the question is today on the unintended consequences is how many hops away is too many? If one hop is, my wallet touched Tornado Cash, so now it is a sanctioned wallet versus 3 wallets down from me touch Tornado Cash, and is that a sanctioned wallet? And so in thinking about the ETH2 contracts having been deployed through Tornado Cash, if I am a staker on ETH2 when we want to deploy, proof of stake Ethereum, have I now been 1 or 2 hops away from Tornado Cash? And what will that mean for my wallet from a long-term perspective? So as Mike said, I think that the thought process through what all the unanticipated consequences would be was very narrow here because it, seems like a very severe reaction to software that is being used for some illicit activity.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. That's fantastic. Yeah, I think really helpful to think through that. There's a lot of nuance and complexity to the amount of collateral impact here, and that's the sort of stuff that we like really need to be engaging as fast as possible. I think with the government and educating them on that, because there's just a lot of complexity, but there's also a lot of real lives at stake here. So yeah, I'd love to turn it over to in terms of that engagement to folks that have been on that front lines for a long time, including the big picture, like Peter Van Valkenburg. So maybe turn it over there, and then want to welcome others to just start jumping in, and we'll work on it, like Nelson Rosario and Dante and Sheila and some others. But Peter, do you want to jump in and give us a sense?
Yeah, sure. So we've been sort of scrambling to work with, allies, folks that we talk to either in the agencies or congressional staff to just get a clearer picture of what everybody thinks about this and how they're perceiving it. Because I think I'm glad we started with you, Michael, going over sort of like the history of past actions, and Ari as well, especially sort of so that we can contrast the Blender.io sanction to the Tornado Cash sanction, because that is where there is a big change. I don't think you saw a big amount of outrage in the crypto community because of the Blender sanction, because of course it was a custodial exchange. I'd add, these are not just terms that we use in the abstract as technologists. These are terms that in many ways have been used in guidance from FinCEN, no less. So FinCEN is, of course, a different branch of Treasury than OFAC, but in 2019, Mike, you know this quite well, FinCEN published guidance that actually clearly defined the difference between an anonymizing software provider and an anonymizing service provider, the service provider being one who has custody or control over the funds during the mixing. And FinCEN said, look, for our rules, which are, again, the Bank Secrecy Act rules, not the sanctions emergency powers rules, but a different rule set, but a similar issue, at least at stake. For our rules, only custodial, only these service providers, not software providers, are money services businesses, and therefore need to register with FinCEN and identify their customers. So this distinction has been in both technical circles where it really matters, because we need to know what we're building, and we want to build things that are not, trusted, are not weak points or choke points in our infrastructure. And there are also distinctions that have been in policy for a long time. Now, the difference between Blender and Tornado, as far as how we now look at this sanction against Tornado, is important, but it's also important not to overstate it. So I do not think personally, although we're still kind of working through arguments and how we're thinking about these things, that you can necessarily make a particularly strong argument that, Tornado Cash is not an entity or some sort of like unincorporated organization of persons. Because, as far as I know, Blender.io wasn't incorporated in any legal jurisdiction either. It was sort of an unincorporated organization of people working together. And obviously, there are people who wrote software, there's people who did various things, and there are, in fact, people who still retain control of some of the admin keys to some subset of the Ethereum addresses that are listed in the sanction in the sanction order and on the SDN list. And so, it's important not to overstate this. There's no entity, so you can't sanction. I think what we're coming around to as we talk with people and and Jerry and I think about our own thinking on this is we should be very specific. There are 45 or so Ethereum addresses listed in that SDN list, and some of them are just donation addresses where you can donate to developers working on the project. Those are just, somebody has a private key, can spend those funds. And those people are, if you were to identify any people, the people who would most likely be Tornado Cash, to the extent that entity is liable for anything and therefore deserves sanction. I'm not saying that they do, but there is an entity there, and whoever controls those keys is, of course, that entity. Now, there are a whole bunch of other addresses, and I would say the most deeply consequential addresses to the operation of Tornado Cash, where you can deposit a certain amount of ETH or DAI or USDC, get a zero-knowledge proof that allows you to then withdraw later without a link between those two transactions, and therefore achieving privacy for any number of reasons, for legitimate reasons as well. those addresses, the deposit addresses, their controller or their operator in the smart contract is set to the 0 address. So we can know with a great amount of certainty that those addresses, the one actually doing the mixing, not only are they not under the control of a person, they aren't even property. And so here's briefly what I mean about that. The IEEPA, which is the statutory basis for the sanctions law, allows the president to cite emergencies, create an executive order about emergency. In this case, it's a cybersecurity order because of North Korean hackers and things like that. It actually goes all the way back to the Obama administration. And then it allows the president to identify persons or entities, sanction them, and block Americans' ability, or people in the US's jurisdiction, their ability to transact with, use, nullify, etc., that property. And so if we look at this list of addresses after it says Tornado Cash on the SDN list, some of these are the property of some entity called Tornado Cash, like the donation address where there's funds that have been donated to help build a protocol to do things like mixing. Now, I am not saying that means that those people deserve sanction for that, but in that case, there is an entity and there is property, and that address is an alias for that property. For the actual Ethereum smart contract addresses that do the mixing, that is not the property of any person. We know that because these are just a series of ones and zeros of code running on the Ethereum blockchain with no ability to update it, to change it, to alter it in any way that will respond deterministically to the conditions that it faces in the world. You send the right data to it, you send the right ETH to it, it will do what it's supposed to do. And again, that controller feature that that admin key feature that some smart contracts have is provably set to a null address, to the 0 address. And so under my reading of the sanctions laws of the IEEPA, I'm not sure it's okay to sanction that thing, because that thing isn't property, and sanctions are about the property of foreign nationals or persons or entities on the list. And that thing, not only is it not property, it's not the property, or it's not even under the physical control of any sanctioned entity. And so it'd be almost like, we discover that Phillips, whoever that guy was, who invented the Phillips head screwdriver, did something very, very bad. And we sanction his bank accounts. But then we say also, you're not allowed to use Phillips head screwdrivers anymore. That would be, I think, unquestionably an overreach of our sanctions authority. And I think the argument that we're going to pursue, whether it's just in talking with people in Washington, D.C., socializing these ideas, or possibly one day in a challenge in court, is that that's what you're doing. You're telling people to stop using Phillips head screwdrivers because Phillips did something wrong. You're allowed to go after Phillips and his bank accounts, and you're allowed to tell Americans stop paying Phillips, but you can't tell them to stop using their screwdrivers.
No, thanks, Peter. That's such a great overview, and I think hopefully that's very compelling to folks in DC, and I say there's someone in DC having a lot of these conversations as fast as possible. But I do think it highlights how this really is different. I think there's always a measure of controversy about sanctions is in terms of an economic tool and collateral impact, but this really is a different one than anything else. And I want to, first of all, this is incredibly overwhelming on choosing between speakers here to get up in as fast as I can, because there's so many great people. So let me just actually, before I even talk anymore, I'd like to ask Jay Ramaswamy real quick to jump in, just because he's done so much legal work in this space as well. Jay, if you could jump in and I'll and introduce yourself.
Sure, happy to. Thanks for letting me speak. First of all, I just want to make sure you guys can hear me. Okay, great. So Jay Ramaswamy, I'm currently the Chief Legal Officer at A16Z. Before my current role, I was at Cello as the Chief Compliance and Risk Officer for that blockchain protocol, and then spent a number of years in financial services and in the government, working with Michael over at the asset forfeiture money laundering section, but also a prosecutor at the Southern District of New York and in the cybercrime section. So I have kind of seen some of these issues percolating before, and I wanted to pull back for a moment and maybe put this in a larger context and then drive the conversation in that direction. I'm not sure I have the expertise of Peter or others who have already spoken, but I think the context I would put this in is kind of in the broader encryption debates that have happened over the past 2-3 decades, and that I think many are probably familiar with. In general, the government has historically been very uncomfortable with broad dissemination of encryption tools. And I think what we're seeing here is a clash of two sort of regimes that are coming to a head. In the earlier rounds of the encryption debate, there wasn't really a set of laws, rules, and regulations that applied to allow the government to directly try to regulate encryption. And so what ended up happening was there was different tools that were used. There was jawboning. There were attempts to pass laws and put in kind of technological backdoors. Ultimately, the government settled, I think, on kind of designating encryption as effectively a munition under the control laws. And that debate still kind of goes on now from time to time with law enforcement when there are cases where encryption needs to be cracked. But I think it's important to see that larger context, because I think what you're now seeing is, with the rise of kind of a new cryptographic settlement layer on the internet, those debates are now coming to a head and clashing with what is really an pre-existing regime that has existed for a while, saying whether it's sanctions, whether it's AML, whether it's actually kind of facilitating money laundering. There's a series of laws, rules, and regulations that have existed for the past 50 years. And when you start introducing a value layer on the internet, and it's no longer just information, but settlement and property rights and currency transactions or financial transactions, these two start clashing. And I don't think we really know the answer to how we address that clash. What are the rights, responsibilities, and regulations that apply when you introduce a value settlement layer on the internet as opposed to a pure information layer? And that's where cases like the Bernstein case, that I'm sure all are familiar with, that sort of came down in the late 90s, which made this distinction between source code that was protected speech and that couldn't be sort of attacked by the government, and financial transactions, which under these regimes can be. So I just want to throw that out there, really more as a discussion point for maybe others to take up on. And the second thing I'll kind of throw out there is the other axis to really pay careful attention to is when it comes to financial surveillance and the regulations that are involved in financial surveillance and sanctions. The key thing is that the traditional system actually had privacy rights baked into it. They may have been imperfect, but there are various privacy protections through the Right to Financial Privacy Act, through very strict regulations on whether, for example, certain information like SARS can be disclosed to the public under criminal penalty. They were imperfect, but they were attempts to sort of mediate between surveillance and privacy rights. But they were all built for a world in which privacy, in a sense, was the default, where things were kept on private ledgers and you had to breach that privacy in order to surveil or to do other things. When you move to a world where actually transparency is the default, and that's true on the broader internet, but even more so now on blockchains, you actually have to start thinking differently about privacy and very carefully about privacy, where there are potentially technological solutions, but the legal frameworks have to change as well to understand that there are very legitimate reasons in a broad, transparent world to have privacy. But I don't think the laws have caught up on that side. And so I think that as part of this discussion, it's important to understand the sort of technical and tactical issues that we're all dealing with now, which is, how do I deal with this sanctions issue? How do I navigate through it? How do I potentially challenge it? But also understand that there's a broader policy context that we're all going to struggle with over the next decade, I think, to try to understand how does privacy work when, one, you move to a world of transparency, public ledgers and transparency, and two, when you move to a world where existing long-standing financial surveillance techniques and regulations clash with an open and permissionless internet. So I don't think it's very helpful compared to what the other speakers have said, but I just wanted to throw that perspective out there for discussion.
Thanks, Jay. No, incredibly helpful perspective. I think that's great, and I do think actually as you talk about the sort of encryption wars in history, and as well as the sort of open internet. I want to just turn to Dante for a bit because he's written on this for years actually, and get his perspective.
Sure. Well, first of all, I hope the audio is coming through okay. I'm beaming in because when Jill and Michael Mosier called the Avengers together, then I was honored to be among that group to try to shed some light on these issues. So not a lot more to add than what was shared thus far, but maybe the perspective I wanted to share was, at some level, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And by the time, either a technology or an activity hits the raw nerve of national security, unfortunately, what we're seeing in these OFAC sanctions is that the premise of being able to micro-target bad actors perhaps worked too well, right? The idea that, there is a cottage industry, companies like TRM Labs and Elliptic and many others that can micro-target illicit activity, track and trace anybody armed with an internet-connected device as a part of that collective witness that makes the net impact of these innovations an exponential improvement in financial crime compliance. The same may not be true for the time it hits the national security raw nerve. And so I think that's where this case is radically different. And so I think no one on today's conversation, and frankly, no one in the broader industry wants to see, these tools being co-opted by rogue regimes or nuclear powers that have sort of, hell-bent intentions on ruining everybody's way of living. On the other hand, the point of being able to create a much more inclusive financial system where privacy, innovation, inclusion, and protecting the integrity of the financial system are not competing objectives is somehow being missed. And I think this is being missed for quite a long time, right? The post 9/11 financial crime compliance frameworks pre-exist any of the technologies that we're talking about. And on the one hand, regulators and policymakers talk about this idea of technology neutral, activity-based, risk-based regulations. But what I think anyone on this call who's been in the blockchain domain for a while would understand is that the second you touch on cryptography, the second you touch on device-centric banking and software intermediated capital markets, DeFi, and the whole domain of self-hosted wallets and sort of this new model for financial services, we're breaking a lot of boundaries. But in there, I think there's also an enormous opportunity. And there's also, frankly, I come from the world of all hope is not lost. And that, in an open letter I put out today and a letter I've sent out to many of you on this call or on this conversation this evening, I think this is an enormous important call to action to really underscore that privacy, security in a financial life that's device-centric and powered by technology are not trade-offs. And we have a window of time, in my humble opinion, to really drive deep into the legislative conversation that's taking place on Capitol Hill, to the hope and to the extent that it is an earnest one between Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry, to get some sensible legislation on what the President's Working Group has called for on stablecoins. In there, I think there ought to be an absolute, protection and enshrine the values of privacy in financial life as one of those pillars. I also think we shouldn't be completely cynical either, and ideally leverage the ongoing work with the executive order and the various rounds of consultations that take place publicly to really underscore the idea that open source technology, non-proprietary technology, public blockchain infrastructure, and software are neutral. And you could regulate the activity down to the endpoint, and you could pursue bad actors and give them no place to hide. But to effectively ban software would be the equivalent of trying to ban email because you didn't like the message that it conveyed. And so we've seen many, many cases like this in the past. At Circle, we aim to, as we've done all along, lead from the front, try to make this an important part of our policy efforts as we, go through the balance of this year. But that's broadly, I think where I stand. And I think the other piece I would just say is the premise of these innovations is that you could even execute a good transaction in a bad place. We've demonstrated this in the past with a well-documented case in the Financial Times. And Michael, you're one of our best spokespeople for it, of using USDC for transactions in Venezuela when the government was otherwise in the hands of the wrong actors. And so I think that premise of financial freedom, the presumption of privacy and financial freedom, and the use of non-proprietary technology for these innovations needs to be continuously defended and vigorously defended. And it's now hit this sort of new raw nerve where, this cannot become a precedent where the technology itself is what's on the docket.
Thanks so much, Dante. Eloquent as always, incredible. So thank you so much. I'd love to turn actually to Reid Hoffman, who's on, which is it's great to have you here, Reid. And I think one of the things that might be helpful, Jay mentioned the encryption wars, and Dante's talked from a historical perspective to getting into us now as well. And I think given your experience, back at eWorld, acquired by AOL, and then at PayPal and LinkedIn, and just being in this space over the course of time through the internet and software, would love to get your perspective on where we are and how you see the priorities.
Well, I think it's really great that you guys are hosting this conversation. I think it's really important. And there's obviously a number of people, inclusive of yourself, who are more expert on the specifics around the cases, the legality, the legal mechanisms. What do those, all look like? I think part of the reason why it's so important is because what you really want to be kind of driving towards is where technology can be modified to be part of the solution. So, for example, an obvious thing that what's going on here is, in part, we do need governments having financial measures to control, sustaining illegal behavior, whether it's terrorism, whether it's rogue states, whether it's drug cartels, etc. So you need to have regulatory participation in these things. And, and to some degree, it goes all the way back to, prohibition, because it was the only way they could really, once you had the alcohol, gangs at such a level of strength, the only way you could actually, in fact, really bring that kind of activity and illegal forces under control was to do, income tax and other kinds of things within the financial system as a way of doing it. And so that's part of the reason why they, regulatory system has to be ingrained into, fundamental financial systems. On the other hand, of course, we want a internet set of financial systems. We want software innovation that's not contained by oligarchic, banking systems. We want certain kinds of privacy, we want other kinds of things. And so the question is, how do you put these puzzle pieces together? How do you assemble them in an optimal way? And I think part of the thing that is great about this discussion is trying to think about, how does technology bring these things together and change the scope of what is possible? And I think that's part of what we're looking at when we examine these things. And part of the thing that we need to make sure that we're engaging with, kind of the various government agencies in the right way is to make sure that they're not trying to close off good futures while they're also trying to close off bad futures. And what are the suggestions that we can make about what the shape of what we can do and the shape of what they can do in order to do that. The point is it's a technological shape to how we can actually change the scope of future possibility. And that's the kind of thing that we want to be speaking with some, kind of group voices to get it. And I don't think saying, it's okay to let the North Koreans run rampant because that's an acceptable price. That's not the universe that's going to play out. So we have to give them spaces in which you say, here's where regulation can play a really good role. Anyway, and I'll pause there.
No, I think it's a great point, Reid. And I just want to hand over to some of the builders who we have in here, Tor, Alex, to talk about how they're thinking about this and approaching it. John Woo as well from Aztec. Yeah. Tor, take it away.
I just really wanted to carry forward the prohibition analogy because this is actually something that I had just finished doing a lot of substantial reading about, not because I thought that this was going to happen, but because I was really interested in drinking. So first of all, thanks everybody for participating in this as a builder versus a legal expert. I mean, we really rely on your expert opinions trying to build the right pathways forward from a technology perspective. I'm with Secret Network, but obviously, like, I have tons of respect for every single person in the space building privacy solutions, researching cryptography, et cetera. And the prohibition analogy was the one that stuck with me just for a moment there, because I remember, like, historically, the reason that prohibition happened wasn't just because there was some sort of groundswell of unanimous public support for the idea that we should outlaw drinking. A lot of people actually liked drinking, including the senators who voted in favor of prohibition, who continued to drink during prohibition because they had the means to avoid the laws that had been placed on other citizens. They were able to essentially pay to not comply. And they were the famous, the dry senators who were secretly wets. Now, what ended up happening, the reason that this was allowed to happen was because on the other side of the debate, the bar owners and the people who were also the liquor distributors were not aligned. The people in the liquor industry wanted the saloons banned because they only sold beer, and that would allow them to do better liquor distribution. And on the other hand, the people in the beer industry were pushing against the liquor distributors, and the liquor distributors retaliated and started, it was a whole mess because there was no alignment on the idea that there were threats actually greater to that industry than just being able to compete directly with one another. And it feels like, as a builder in the space for the last few years, the emphasis has been on internal competition and not on sustainability of the space. So to just see the conversation at least start to head in that direction again, where we realize there's causes larger than the individual projects, if that ends up being one of the net benefits of this conversation being started by these actions of regulatory overreach, then I see that as the only positive maybe we can take away from this. And I would love to see this momentum continue past the Twitter spaces and past the headlines as this continues, because what tends to happen in the past is it's out of sight, out of mind, and people languish in jail or in the court systems, and we sort of forget that there's real people being impacted by this on a daily basis. So I'm just going to echo everything that was said earlier about continuing the fight actively in the moment and really understanding the consequences are today, regardless of the exercise of whether this will eventually be held up in courts. The consequences are now, and we can't stop building or coordinating or co-organizing to reach the outcomes that if we want to make sure that these types of technologies are not banned from public. That's my piece. I really am enjoying this. I'm going to hand it over to everybody else. You can take me down from here, but thanks again for organizing, Jill, Michael.
Tor, thanks so much. It's great to hear from folks like actively building in this space, and totally agree. Like this is real people's lives. These are real people, whether it's people getting picked up, it's people under authoritarian regimes like Dante was talking about. Like this needs to be constantly a constant issue of vigilance, because like the sanction that happened this week, it can happen at any time. So I'm really excited that people are getting aligned and engaging on this. And I actually want to turn it over to Sheila Warren, who's here from the Crypto Council for Innovation, because she's been doing a lot of the global work. And I while OFAC is here in the US, where many of us are, I think we don't want to lose sight of the global picture here. Sheila?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. For those who don't know me, prior to joining the Crypto Council, I was at the World Economic Forum working, heading up tech policy. So talking a lot about cybersecurity, talking a lot about education around issues around encryption as a general matter and privacy all over the world, including, interestingly enough, in China, which is a whole separate conversation for another time. But one of the things I just wanted to mention quickly, and I'll echo, there's just so many experts here and so much has really been covered so well, is I think it's the expansion. To me, something I'm watching with a lot of interest / concern, depending on the hour of the day and the month, it's just the expansion of what it means to be a U.S. person. So even leaving aside even the global nature of a lot of these issues, the reality is that U.S. sanctions are predicated on the assumption that what you're blocking or banning or prohibiting is the engagement of a so-called U.S. person with a forbidden entity, whatever that looks like. And I think we've had some discussion about what is that classification. But what we're seeing now is an expansion of that definition in my mind. And so historically, it was pretty clear, to be a U.S. person, you had a designation, you were a citizen, that, you resided on U.S. soil. There was some pretty logical nexus to the United States. And now what we're seeing as we move away from traditionally understood, a person is a person, is a person as a wallet address, right? The identifiers that we're using, to the idea that some folks are able to, shift residence, and that's going to mean that you're no longer subject to some of these restrictions is eroding, and it's eroding at a pretty rapid pace. And I think it's something that's not getting enough discussion. Now, some parts of the government around the world kind of welcome that, and others find it to be really problematic. And as we're discussing this with various folks all over the place, we're finding that the attitudes around this, the general awareness of this is not high, but the attitudes towards it are highly variable and highly varied in terms of what it means. But what it means ultimately is that the coordination that has to happen between governments is weakening, it's lessening, because any individual government, apologies for background noise, any individual government is going to be able to expand its reach. And that could be true not just from the US to other places, but also within Europe as well. Now, I think also in context, you have to look at the fact that there's a lot of regulatory activity, and many folks here work closely with us and with others on this. In Europe, you're seeing this all over ASEAN. You're even seeing a regulatory model coming out of Australia. And a lot of that is focused on defining illicit activity, defining it relatively broadly, and trying to figure out who gets swept within it. So again, I think we have to focus on a lot of issues that are principles at a principled level, code of speech, technology neutrality. These things are critically important. But on a practical front, I think we need to be observing the slow but steady expansion of the powers of various governments to pull within their jurisdiction those who wouldn't necessarily assume that they were within jurisdiction. And I'll leave it there for now. But thanks so much for pulling this together.
Thanks so much, Sheila, and thanks for doing all that work globally too. And we get in a bit of a bubble here, but it's everywhere. I mean, there's people everywhere impacted by all this and impacted by what's going on here. And actually, to that, I'd love to pull in Nelson Rosario. We've heard from a lot of policy folks and people that are in the building space, and Nelson sort of straddles all of them as a lawyer that works with a lot of builders in many different spaces through computer into cryptography and crypto. And I'd love to just hear what you're thinking about and seeing on the ground, Nelson.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. It's great to be talking with everybody here. Hopefully you can hear me just fine. I don't have a ton to add to what's been said so far, but I do think we're kind of getting at what I would say is the meta stage of crypto, in the sense that, at the very beginning, it was focused on transactions. It was very much a micro game. And then the industry kind of grew up a bit more. And now we're kind of playing a totally different game, which I would say is this meta game, where the rules that, people had to abide by up to this point are much, I don't want to say amorphous, but maybe stricter. And they're rules that, nation states play by. And that's just a totally different ball game. So, a couple of people talked about that, and, I just don't know how that's gonna play out. And some teams are thinking about this, but the entire industry needs to be thinking about it, because, blockchains are decentralized, but people are not. And yeah, this is a very interesting conversation. And in a certain sense, it's kind of the main conversation, right? But, we need to be thinking about the game slightly differently than we have up to this point, I would say. And that's all I have.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nelson. That's really helpful. I do want to, since you took it in a bit of a philosophical direction, and we have Zuko here, which I can't believe I'm getting to introduce Zuko, but I feel like I want to get to him and dive into that a little bit.
And I also just want to encourage Zuko. I want you to say your part here, but then I just want speakers to start jumping in here. John, Evan, Henry, Elena, you all have great perspectives as well. Just hop in and feel free to take it in whatever direction. But Zuko first, please. The legend himself. Go ahead.
But what philosophy? One thing that caught my attention at the beginning of this was a couple folks talked about the national security angle and sort of war is happening, right? Cyber war is happening. And I think that's a big, big gap between some people's like focus and their experience in life and others between whether we live in wartime or live in peacetime. Because, when an enemy army is threatening to enslave and murder everyone then you have very different social organization. But when you have safety, then you can have innovation, you can build, you can increase prosperity and opportunity for everyone. You can have civil rights in peacetime. And I guess there are two different large-scale, long-term transitions happening in the world. Well, maybe three if we count various wars and conflicts and competitions at nation state level. But one is globalization, where policies and actions taken by one group or person can impact others all around the world. And I was thinking about that because of the allegation that the cyber thieves of the government of North Korea were using this tool. And I was thinking about Zcash users that I know of. They're all the ones that I know of, for people who reach out to me, not that I can tell anything about them if they don't consensually choose to disclose to me, but everyone who comes up to me and talks to me, which is a lot of people over the years, are just like normal, law-abiding, small-time people who care about their freedom and their prosperity. The ones in America are just ideological. It's just like the libertarian communities in New Hampshire who use Zcash and other such tools because that's their community's values. And they feel good about doing that with their friends and family in their community. And then the ones from other places, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Russia, China, and those people need this kind of security because they're being actively targeted in many cases by not even bad laws, also bad laws, but also just by like thugs who are protected by the government and who are abusing their position in order to rob other people, So, okay, what's my point? Let's be aware that if you think you live in peacetime, not everyone else thinks that. And if you think you live in wartime, that's not where everyone else is necessarily living. B, the world is changing because of globalization. And then C, the world is changing because of technology. Let me just say one thing about that, which is that before cryptocurrency or simultaneous with cryptocurrency, we've seen a historically unprecedented transition from a world of resiliency in which one organization or actor exerting power over others was more difficult. There was more friction, and it costed more the more people they're going to control. And only thanks to information technology starting maybe 20, 25 years ago have we suddenly transitioned entire populations into a world where one company or one government organization can monitor everyone all at once, like 1 billion people all at once. And the final thing I want to say is that's already bad enough. That's already scary because it's a very dramatic departure from every successful human society ever. So that's already a precarious place that we've all found ourselves, and we should be cognizant that this is not normal. This is not like your normal old sort of middle of the road conservatism should not be comfortable in this situation. But the final thing I want to say is we're on the verge of another transition driven by technology, where the combination of AI and automation means that not only can 1 billion people simultaneously be observed and surveilled, but also they can be manipulated and nudged and controlled by AIs by control over their possessions and their ability to access things both in the real world and online. So there's a big picture, and I remain convinced that in the long run, these technologies of both encryption and also of decentralized cooperation are going to prove to be actually the solution to these vast risks that we've unthinkingly put ourselves in.
Yeah. And if I can just follow up, Zuko. So, Jill, you did tell us to just jump in here. So that's what I'm going to do. So, hey, everyone, I'm Alex. I'm the COO of a project called Alio, but I'm also a veteran of the U.S. Army. And I think I want to weigh in just based on what Zuko had mentioned, and kind of this concept of, relatively abstract of, like wartime, peacetime. And I think it's important to bring this perspective because a lot of times the justification for actions like this and the justification for this sanction in particular often invokes a national defense. And, for me, this is something that I spent 10 years of my life dedicated to. I've been deployed 3 times overseas. I've fought wars against people who are undoubtedly bad people, right? And, no one in their right mind would want to enable them with any tools. Let alone enable them to raise money to continue their activities. That said, I think that this idea that this technology is bad for national defense is completely wrong-headed. I actually think it's essential that we have these technologies and that we preserve these liberties for our national defense. And the reason for that is twofold. So one, and maybe the more obvious thing is that, do we want it from a national defense perspective? Do we want a country or a system where everything is fully public, that any potential adversary at any time can mine the financial data of every single, let's just use in this case, some Americans? I mean, potentially the amount of information you could glean just from that alone is terrifying. And this kind of came up, I think, before when there was discussions about encryption. Look, encryption is like if your job is to surveil other people, you want encryption to be weak. But if you want to send secure messages yourself, you want encryption to be strong. The thing is, you can't really have it both ways. And so I think having privacy of our financial transactions assured, I think, is a critical piece of national defense that I wish people would consider more. And secondly, and maybe more philosophically, like, look, there's the thing that makes us as Western, broadly speaking, societies different from the people who, I was at war with, frankly, is these values of liberty, right? These are what makes us different. And this is what I believe personally, very strongly, that, this is what defines our values. And if we give up these values to become maybe, for some short-term gain, I think we lose sight of the broader picture of what, of who we are. And I think that's a really critical thing, because last time I checked, there's not people rushing to immigrate to North Korea. There's North Koreans who would love to immigrate to the United States. And I think that's largely because of the values that we hold and we maintain and we fight for. So that's all I wanted to say.
Amen, Alex. Well said.
I know I've had my chance to speak, so I don't want to talk for too long at this point, but things that both Zuko, and it is a total honor to build off of something you said and Alex said, this conversation has gotten very existential, but even to take 2 points from both of them and bring it back to the practical level, Zuko said, so many regular people come up to me. When we're talking about the 60 or more % of licit transactions that are going on Tornado Cash, that is with individual users for the most part, with self-hosted wallets who value their financial privacy. So to take it even back to something that both Mike and Ari started with, to talk about, well, when sanctions are imposed in banks or on countries or something, there's all this preparation done. It's usually preparation to help other types of institutions. We've sanctioned Bank X, and so we need to talk to the other institutions or large scale financial actors who may be impacted by that. But this really comes down to, how do individuals have to then think about conducting themselves? And I think one of the most important things that we can do now is ask for really practical advice, right? We all have seen the dustings that happen where small amounts were sent out to people like Shaq and Jimmy Fallon and a lot of people in the crypto, well-known people in the crypto space. And there's little to no guidance on what they're supposed to do now and how this sanction will affect their lives. So that's really important. I think the other piece that Alex brought up is, yes, there are people who want financial privacy, and you do not want to be able to have every movement you've made tracked. But the beauty, and something I think that I talk about a lot when I'm speaking to regulators and policymakers, is this is actually really good for regulators, right? The transparency of the blockchain is helpful. And so for people like for actors like TRM Labs and other blockchain analytics companies, the work that they're doing will allow there to be tracing through Tornado Cash that otherwise may not be able to be done when you have actors like North Korea and other people laundering illicit funds or the proceeds from illicit activity. And while Tornado Cash may make it harder, there's a lot that is known already about the way that these actors move, including through Tornado Cash. Most of it is through the 100 ETH pool, just given the size of a lot of their illicit activity. And so if you really spur people like TRM Labs and other analytics companies to do that work, the blockchain, the transparency of blockchain-enabled technology is going to help us from a regulatory perspective long-term too.
Kind of contradicts what Alex said previously.
Right. So just to branch off of the point that Alex made about transparency and security and privacy actually being important from a security point of view, I think a really interesting non-blockchain example of that was the Strava incident from a few years ago, where it turned out that people would just go and log their run or whatever on Strava like normal people, except that all of that data was being leaked through the Strava website. And so there were, as a result, these high resolution GPS traces of all of the pathways through all of the US military facilities all over the world. And that's an example of the way that we have such a an interconnected digital world now, that any kind of we're so far gone on privacy that even these kind of apparently trivial casual things can actually provide really, really detailed information, targeting information to people who have, I would say, pretty adversarial and bad intent. So that's just branching off of the point that Alex made. On the more general point about the collateral damage, I would say that as a builder, right? So I work on building a private DEX. The approach by regulators of we'll just arbitrarily and capriciously sanction all of these legitimate people and all of their activity with no regard to the consequences really destroys a lot of the motivation or the belief that working with some regulatory agency is actually going to be effective, right? Tornado Cash, in order to use Tornado Cash as a person, you have to be able to know okay, what did I put in? What did I get out, right? So Tornado Cash already has, and this to give credit where it's due, this was originally developed for Zcash. There's already a viewing capability where you can view all of your own transactions. You can take that information, you can hand it over to somebody else and say, look, this is all my activity. And that doesn't seem to matter, right? So then, why would anybody who's actually building something be interested in trying to do, try to make a regulator's life easier if the actual way that's going to play out is as soon as we start building a compliance feature, then a regulator will say, well, how much information can you give us about these users? And no matter how much you say, it's never going to be enough.
So I want to jump in here next. So thank you again for hosting this. And I do want to highlight all of the builders that are here, because we have Zuko from Zcash, Henry from Penumbra, John, we're from Aztec, obviously Espresso. We are all building tools for privacy, and we're all building it for obviously not the bad actors. We're building it for good people. I myself am working on Ironfish, which is also a privacy protocol. And so the question that builders have is, what are the guidelines and regulations to make this right? So basically what Henry said, what do we need to build in order to make this right? Because if you look at the article that came out with Tornado, they specifically called it a mixer. And if you kind of look into how Tornado was built, to Henry's point, it took a lot of inspiration from Zcash, which is not a mixer. And it does have UKeys, and they have a compliance tool on their website. And so they have actually built some attempts to make it more compliant. And I think all the projects that I've listed are also building very similar compliance tools. And to Henry's point, it's like, well, that's not enough, even though we thought that it was. So from a builder's perspective, kind of echoing some of Henry's thoughts, it is scary or maybe even frustrating to kind of have no guidelines, because we do understand that privacy is important, especially in this financial crypto space. And yet we're not really given like guidelines in terms of how to make it right. And then what Alex said previously really resonated with me. So I'm originally from Russia. A lot of our users for Ironfish are actually Russian as well. And so when you think about like privacy and how does privacy actually shape our society and how does it make it better? I can definitely compare and contrast how lack of privacy or privacy in the United States have had really long-term effects on the culture of the country and of the society. And in the United States, we have security and kind of comfort to be creative and to build great things and to build companies. And in the United States, we have this ability to have the safety to form a team and build something ambitious. And if you look at countries like Russia, China, North Korea, more of the surveillance states, we are lacking that culture, right? And so, privacy has these really long-term effects that are incredibly beneficial for the country and for society. And it's really worrisome to see that being thrown away. Like, I think we are entering into this ideological kind of tension between countries like China, where surveillance is like the main ideology, and then versus countries like the United States, where freedom is the main ideology. And yet, I think of freedom and privacy as like going hand in hand, and yet like through action, we're being shown that that's not the case. And to me, as an immigrant to the United States, that is very, very concerning. So I'll pause here.
Yeah, Elena, wanted to build out on that. And this is John Wu from Aztec Network. We're also building a private network. I think I just wanted to underscore the importance of dialogue and nuance and social consensus in this debate, because I think a lot of what we've been talking about so far has been focused on this notion that some things are obviously bad, and that there's this like balance of harms framework, right? Like we keep hearing the citation that 60 to 70%, of the volume on Tornado Cash was illicit. And first, I'm just not sure that's the correct pragmatic angle with which to attack this problem. And I'm not sure there is consensus on what is obviously bad. We're building, out of one side of our mouth, we're saying that we're building credibly neutral technologies. But on the other, we want these to be widely adopted and commercially successful. And that tension is being revealed in this case specifically because neutrality is not positive from a sovereign government perspective. Something that's credibly neutral to a Chinese person is not credibly neutral to a Western person. And so I think at the risk of us creating these walled gardens where we get freedoms that are, circumscribed by sovereign governments, I think the principled interests of crypto might be challenged by its commercial ones. And to talk about the balance of harms framework, I don't think that is a values debate. It's not necessarily purely freedom versus surveillance. And let me give you two topics that are controversial in the United States from, a rights and principles perspective: abortion and guns, right? These are fundamentally rights debates. Who has the right to life, a baby or a mother? Who has the right to life, a gun owner or a victim? And even within the gun debate, I think there's this at least democratically accepted notion that guns are here to stay. But even within that rights debate, there's a consensus settlement on what type of guns are appropriate. For instance, you're not allowed to own automatic weapons. And there's nothing enshrined, in the Second Amendment that says automatic weapons should not be allowed. That's just a matter of our pragmatic social consensus and a matter of our democracy having a debate. And so I think a lot about practical and neutral deterrence, where we need to be able to implement practical deterrences which are always going to be fundamentally freedom restricting from a values perspective, right? Something that's totally credibly neutral, like tornado, is going to have more utility than tornado with deposit limits, for instance, right? There's nothing that says that that deposit limits are the most free thing that you could possibly do. And so I think the values debate is actually much harder to settle on. And what we really need is a dialogue and a democratic process. And I think that is the great disservice that has been done with this OFAC conversation, which is if we think about where it originated because of a practical security failure. And that security failure can only be enforced by our social consensus within the ecosystem. And maybe, to be a little bit more controversial about it, upstream regulation. You can imagine if regulators did a better job upstream, demanding a certain level of security audit or disclosure about centralization, that the kind of like first moving action here, which was the hack of the Ronin Bridge, might not have happened. And now we have this overcorrection by regulators downstream. And so really, I think the way to resolve some of these tensions going forward, and maybe this is boring to say, is to have to move away from an us versus them mentality, to go back to democratic processes and conversations about between regulators and builders, to make sure we deeply understand the root cause and not end up in a situation where we're on different sides of an irresolvable values debate. Otherwise, we get a heavily politicized and frankly difficult to resolve issue like some of the primary ones I discussed previously, abortion and guns in the United States.
Yeah, John, I love everything you just said. And if I could just jump in here real quick, I think something that you alluded to is a really important point. So as a maintainer of a privacy protocol, my head, of course, went straight to the implications of this for privacy, right? But I think the issue is actually bigger than just privacy, right? The question that is going to have to be litigated, and I mean that literally, but also in a figurative sense, we're going to have to decide whether digitally neutral tools, in particular financial tools, but just more broadly, digitally neutral tools are going to be permitted by our societies, by our democracies, even though those tools can and will ultimately be used by quote unquote bad actors. And I agree that there's a real challenge there about deciding who and what is a bad actor. So, I think that's like the point. And I would just love to hear some thoughts from others speaking here on that. And in particular, I would love to hear, I get the sense, I don't know if this is correct or not, but I get the sense that if North Korean hackers or some other entity that is worthy of being sanctioned were using some other protocol, not necessarily a privacy protocol, but let's say they were using Uniswap or using something to earn yield or doing whatever, that OFAC or the Treasury would have gone ahead and banned or sanctioned those protocols as well. And so I just think this seems like a broader thing. It's not just about privacy. It's about whether we're going to be allowed to use digitally neutral tools. And yeah, it's I'd love to hear others' thoughts on that. And if I'm right in thinking that it's broader than just privacy.
Ben, this is Gus Coldabella. Glad to follow up on that. And Michael and Jill, thank you for organizing this, and especially for having founders and devs on and focusing on them. I think zooming out, one of the things that we have to deal with as U.S. persons, which is something that we've been talking about since this guidance came out, is that if you're a crypto founder in the United States, you don't just you can't just focus on building. You have to focus on the regs that are coming out of the SEC, the CFTC, the IRS, FinCEN, OFAC, as we've been discussing, and 50 plus jurisdictions around the country that also have something to say about crypto. So the reason I think that all of these people are on this Twitter Spaces right now is because the big dog in the junkyard has made its appearance. I mean, we have, as an industry, have been focused on the SEC for years because they're the loudest and the most active, and in some ways the most annoyingly vague of these regulators. But we know now, and Peter mentioned the statutes before, under IEPA and under this executive order that President Obama signed, the power of the Treasury Department to do things in the crypto ecosystem is massive. And this is the confluence of very important prerogatives, including national security and privacy and decentralization. So that's why this is such a hard issue. I think what's a bit disheartening is that the Treasury Department, and Michael, as an alum, I hope you'll agree with this, has been one of the most lucid, well thought out regulators of the crypto space since they started wading into this area long ago. And this action is not that. We have we have a situation where this order has named some addresses, cited the executive order, but no questions answered about how this works in practice. And one interesting thing is, ironically, in a way, the protocol worked as it was intended to work, right? It's still available on the Ethereum blockchain. People can use it. Now, US persons can't use it. Don't use it if you're a US person. But the principle of decentralization is that, if a sort of centralized actor in the ecosystem is gone or attacked, the protocol still exists. But what the government did here is take out its biggest gun. It said, we're not taking one player out of the ecosystem, we're taking every single US person out of this ecosystem, which is something that, as Peter explained before, we haven't seen before. And that underscores the difference between the front end, which is down, and the smart contract, which will presumably live as long as the Ethereum blockchain does. I mean, the main point that I want to make here is that this is dangerous logic that doesn't have a limiting principle attached to it. And we've heard a lot of analogies, Phillips head screwdriver and the like. If you look at the sort of the legal justification of all of this, there's an executive order that says we have a national emergency. And the national emergency is cyber attacks by nation states against the United States. And when you have a national emergency, the president can ask the Treasury Department to put people on a list who you shouldn't interact with. So North Korea, Lazarus Group, they are on that list. They've committed cyber attacks. We've mentioned Ronan and others. But what we haven't seen before is, when that attacker uses some sort of software to facilitate the thing that the U.S. government wants to knock down, that software itself is the subject of the sanction. And I mean, the analogy that I use is, when you think about this hacking group that may have escaped everyone's mind before, Gunter 2, which was backed by Russia. They stole the DNC's emails and put them up on Dropbox. The bad actor, the cyber attacker, is Gunter 2 that's backed by the FSB. The tool they use to disseminate and cause the harm is Dropbox. It seems to me that this is akin to an order on Dropbox. And given that there is no limiting principle, we know that many ransoms and ransomware attacks are facilitated on the Bitcoin network. All of this activity that we're talking about today is on the Ethereum network. So there needs to be some guidance, some line, some education, I think, that we as a policy community bring to bear with Treasury and the rest of the US government to, first of all, understand what they meant. I'm not convinced that, given the tweet from the Secretary of State, and given the fact that in the order announcing this, in the press release announcing this, the Treasury Department said essentially that every dollar that is flown through Tornado, is money laundering. Both of those things are wrong, right? And that they compared it to Blender.io, and people before on the call have said that, all the reasons that that's different. So I think that there's a large opportunity for education here, and the main takeaway is that we have to work ourselves on privacy protecting solutions at the same time that we're educating the government on ways that they could satisfy all of these national security interests, including privacy, through a more rifle shot approach rather than a blunderbuss approach. And Michael, I'll leave it at that.
Sorry, if I could just jump in here real quick. So I'm a little worried that we're in a bit of an echo chamber, because this entire channel is an agreement that the aggression towards Tornado Cash is unwarranted in certain arguments. And so my guess open-ended question to maybe some of the other speakers here is, how do we interpret this? Because it doesn't seem to matter, right? Like we might have these great opinion pieces about like why you can't prosecute code or why it's unfair, but the result is still the same. And so I guess my open-ended question is like, how do we go from here?
Lena, thanks. I want to jump in here. So my name is Jim Greco. I haven't spoken yet. I run a quantitative hedge fund. We only trade cryptocurrencies. It's called F9 Research. I also sit on the board of Gemini Trust Company. Gemini is a U.S. regulated exchange by the New York Department of Financial Services. I also lead their risk and compliance committee. So a lot of these issues are kind of like near and dear to my heart. And ultimately, like I think that this is actually a very positive development for the crypto community. It's certainly painful for certain participants, particularly for builders or for users. But ultimately, I think it's going to make a much healthier ecosystem. And just to maybe give a little practical background, we raised most of our money in F9 from institutions. And once they kind of got comfortable with our quantitative, trading models and how, what our strategies were, they were really interested in like, hey, am I going to invest in you guys? And are you guys going to end up on the news because like you're helping to launder North Korean money? And I think the North Korean example was actually specifically mentioned during one of our institutional investors due diligence meeting. And they're very interested in sort of like, what is our compliance program for how we evaluate new exchanges to participate in, how we evaluate new DeFi protocols. And they're extremely, extremely nervous about this because like crypto it's brand new for them, right? And like the last thing they're taking a risk by sort of getting involved in this space at a very early stage, at least for an institution. And they don't want them to blow up in their face. And so they put those requirements on the funds that they themselves sort of invest in. And so I think as a fund, like we think a lot about this. And, one thing that I was rather shocked by today is like when earlier somebody said that 30 to 40% of the activity on Tornado Cash was illicit activity. Can you imagine the reaction to a Bloomberg headline that said 30 to 40% of Bank of America's activity facilitated terrorism or facilitated money laundering? The reaction would be insane, right? You would have people hauled off to jail the following day. If you think about just like one of the examples of this is like HSBC, right? Which facilitated money laundering for the Sinaloa drug cartel. It was hundreds of millions of dollars, but in like the grand scheme of their flows every day, which is hundreds of billions of dollars of flows, like very, very small percentage. And yet they were like this was a huge, huge story. They face significant penalties, and if not for, I think the British government stepping in, probably would have been disbanded as a bank, at least in the United States. And so, 30 to 40% is a very, very large number. And just because something has legitimate use cases, I think we're kind of all fooling ourselves if we think that makes it okay, to be supportive of, right? These are, ultimately the organizations that are using Tornado Cash and other products like that. These are not good guys. They're laundering hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to finance terrorism, to finance, whatever North Korea is doing. And so I think that we need to seriously think about that if we want this space to grow beyond just a small group of technologists and sort of libertarians. If we want BlackRock and we want, Goldman Sachs to be sort of involved in this ecosystem, then we need to figure out a way to ensure that products like Tornado Cash, if they do have legitimate use cases, can filter out a lot of the what is the 30 to 40% of illicit activity. So I'll go ahead and stop there, but that's sort of at least my as someone who runs a hedge fund who deals with institutions every day, this is something that I think has been top of mind for us for a very, very long time, and I think we all want this industry to succeed. But if we need to figure out solutions here for problems like Tornado Cash. So
thank you for getting us out of the echo chamber, Jim.
Sorry.
And let's go back into it with Abby, maybe. No, but in all seriousness, Abby, I know that you and your company have been kind of at the center of this conversation this week from a different angle that I think is important to bring up. So let's go over to you. But I am also grateful for Jim's perspective and the offer of the institutional perspective here as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. This has been a really great space. So many thoughts listening to everybody, and it's been great to hear from people who have this institutional and policy perspective. I'm coming at it from the builder perspective. I'm working and contributing to the Radical Project, which its goal is to build a decentralized alternative to code collaboration. And so I can talk about, I think I just want to add a couple comments to bring it back to what can we be doing now? And I think it's very clear that every crypto organization, every DAO needs, anybody who really is building in crypto needs to be proactively strategizing around how they can best support the development of censorship resistant, privacy preserving technology. Because I think to a lot of people, it might seem like crypto is finally waking up. We're getting out of our own echo chamber because censorship of free and open source software and privacy preserving technology has been happening. You could consider this tornado sanction similar to how Russia banned Tor network last year, and how Tor has been having to fight against Russian censorship for a while now. Even the arrest of the Tornado Cash developer has similarities to when Tor exit relay operators have been, arrested by Russian authorities for just operating a node in the network. And so I think that this blunderbuss, what was this word? Blunderbuss. I forget who said that, but I wrote it down because I love it so much. But this blunderbuss approach that is misinformed, this misinformed approach to censorship is incredibly dangerous, because what we're seeing technologies being attacked. We're seeing code being attacked. And so we've talked a lot more about that. So I won't really get into kind of I guess the philosophy behind this. We all agree that this is not great. And I think that we really need to be building more resilient tooling to secure the free and open source web that we all say we're building towards. And so I just wanted to highlight a couple of interesting things that also came out of this, is that a way to build resilient technology is not just in the technology itself, but build more resilient tooling that you're using to build the technology. So along with the Tornado Cash sanction, we saw the GitHub org and the personal GitHub accounts banned. So developers who were contributing to the development of the project immediately fell under sanctions. GitHub was acting actually outside of its mandated sanction ruling, as we'll see actually a lot of platforms not just do the minimum, but do the maximum to protect themselves, which is, we understand, especially when facing such explicit legal action. But this is the wave that's coming, and we need to be building more resistant tooling around these open source ecosystems that we're trying to build a future around and everything. So I think that, like, one thing is investing in the development of more resilient tooling. So I mean, this is a shill for Radical, because Radical is an alternative to GitHub. But also Discord was taken down. The Tornado Cash Discord was taken down. Use Matrix, right? Discourse was taken down. And that one is also really surprising, because you can actually self-host your own open source instance of Discourse, right? What's the solution there? And we actually really need to be actively thinking about how we can build more technically, socially, and politically resilient open source ecosystems, not just the tech itself, but also the ecosystems around that. And that takes coordination, and that takes uncomfortability as well. And it takes investing time and using and adopting these technologies, because this is, I really think, just like the first drop of the waterfall. And also coordinated group effort. We keep saying we need to, like, rally together and all of this. And like a good example that I'd like to pull from is, how did the Tor network circumvent Russian censorship when it was banned last year? They did an open call to action for community members to be running Tor bridges, right? And there was an open campaign that was well documented, well communicated, of how to rally together to serve, the citizens who were being censored, not only in Russia, but in China, Iran, Kazakhstan, right? And these community initiatives can come with technology themselves, and this is what we need to be kind of surrounding ourselves with and coordinating within. Is that, someone said after the Twitter Spaces end, and the hype goes down, we still need to be building the technology. And I'm just this is an open ask. I know it's what we're doing at Radical. We're currently kind of readdressing where do we need to get to become truly censorship resistant, privacy preserving collaboration software. And I think this is the time for people to rally together, because I really don't think it'll stop here. So that's my little rant. I'll stop there.
Abby, thanks. That was a great maybe palate cleanser after going down the institutional side with Jim. And again, I think that the work you're doing is super important. But I'm just looking on Twitter, and Jim, the reaction to your perspective is you've really touched a nerve, it seems. And so I do want to go back just for a moment to this question of what do the needs and wants of institutionals play? What role do they play in terms of the direction that we should be kind of building and going? What are the considerations that we want to have here as we are moving forward, both as builders and policymakers, and also what are the risks of kind of overcompliance? So I suspect that a lot of people have thoughts they want to jump in with on that. So I'll open the floor back up.
I wanted to say I really enjoyed hearing contrary perspective from Jim. Especially, I was interested in the fact that the regulated exchange, Jim and I, that you sit on a board of, is one of the strong institutional supporters of Zcash. I think that's interesting because it points to, basically, we have conflicting values in our community and in our country and in our world, but they're not totally conflicting. They're overlapping. A lot of the more legalistic and constitutional analysis that we heard from these experts early on in this are basically pointing out that the OFAC action is not likely to accomplish the goals of the US government. And Jim's point is that having terrorists and foreign enemy states and rogue states empowered or benefiting from these tools is not what anyone wants. And what I found the most inspiring so far in this conversation is what Alex said earlier, which is that freedom and innovation that comes with freedom, those are that's America's strength. That's America's asymmetric advantage versus other states. And that's also America's values.
One of the things, sorry to interject, but I worked at the intersection of both institutional markets and DeFi. I had the privilege of working with Rebecca Rittig at Aave on decentralization further, but also Aave Arc, which was one of the first institutional-focused DeFi protocols. Now, I think one of the things that we haven't discussed is the fact that the developer, Alexei Petzer, was arrested today in Holland. And I think that brings a bit of a chilling effect, but it also brings up the question of how decentralized our technology is, and then further, what decentralization really means, right? So I think Hester Pierce, in her previous speeches, has talked about decentralized in name only, or DINO. And I think we see a lot of examples of, DINO protocols where developers or stakers or significant beneficial owners have quite a bit of influence in decision making on protocols. And I think that needs to change, right? So if this chilling effect has any positive outcome, then hopefully it will lead to further decentralization of the stack we have built, right? And if you look at Ethereum, I mean, at the end of the day, you can build decentralized protocols on it, but if 3 US-based entities have a significant amount of influence on which transactions get included in the blocks, then I think we're building decentralized technology on a fairly centralized stack. The other thing about, so decentralization has always been a bit of a legal defense. And even before, there was blockchain and crypto, we had Napster and we had BitTorrent. And BitTorrent changed Napster to remove all the servers, right? So that there was not one person or entity that you could point at and say, okay, you are actually stealing music or assisting in piracy. And I think with blockchains also we need to go there. The other thing, so yeah, let's remove dinos. Let's decentralize the stack. Let's at some point there'll be piercing of the DAO wheel, and then the potentially significant token holders or developers that have significant influence that are claiming decentralization as legal defense will have personal liability. In fact, over the last few days, what we saw is that there was a bit of a revolutionary approach on Twitter, and people were saying, okay, we can just fork Tornado Cash, but that's probably not sufficient, right? Because I mean, if there is personal liability, as is the case with potentially with Alexei Petzer today, then I think that sort of revolutionary approach doesn't work, and we have to take this in court and essentially also make sure that our own house is in order. And we are actually decentralizing the protocols. The last thing I would add is that there is a Web3 hypothesis, right? So the Web3 hypothesis is that this is essentially the internet. And, this is not actually financialization. We are not actually dealing with money here. And we should have the same sort of credible neutrality and, the Clinton doctrine to blockchains that we have to the internet. But I think this OFAC action also opens up the debate about whether we are really dealing with the internet or we are dealing with money, and what that means for Web3. My summary to all of this would be that we really need to decentralize in the same way that Tor and BitTorrent are decentralized. We need to move away from dinos, and that means giving up some of the profits, beneficial ownership of tokens, and some of the abnormal profits that we've seen in the industry. But if you're not decentralizing, you're not going to have Web3. So it's quite we need to be honest to ourselves.
So I'd like to chime in on just that topic a little bit, kind of where the rubber meets the road for entrepreneurs and operators. So my name is Ryan Singer. I've been an entrepreneur and investor in the space since I co-founded the first institutional Bitcoin exchange. Winklevoss bought Bitcoin from me before they started Gemini. Same with Pantera and the others. We were an operating Bitcoin exchange at the time the FinCEN guidance came out on March 18th, 2012, or 2013, excuse me. And it was kind of a shot out of the blue. And I think there are these two approaches that we're talking about as being in conflict. But I think Zuko really had a point when he said that a lot of us have a mentality of we've been building in peacetime, And when we're building in wartime, we have different goals and different priorities. So at TradeHill, we were a registered FinCEN money services business. We had an AML program. We had a KYC program. We talked to regulators all the time. But also, we had our servers set up in our server cage so that there was a photo cell where if you opened the door, it would cut power to the cage and you would only get encrypted disks. And the reason we did that is because we were very aware of law enforcement corruption in the space. And we actually did not believe that a third-party warrant would be sufficiently independent and sufficiently tested to be safe with customer funds. So we literally proofed our cage against people coming into the data center with warrants while we had an active compliance program, while we talked to the regulators every day. And so I think a lot of people in the space need to think about not just decentralization in architecture, decentralization in proof of space, actually being a proof of stake. But I think just in general, if we live in a world where they can take down GitHub of politically interesting code, and we live in a world where developers are getting arrested, we need to act like we live in that world, and we need to think about how do we balance compliance and security in wartime, and how do we make sure that that government enforcement actions go through a process that's more like the freedom and rule of law we thought we lived in the U.S. and less like the surveillance and rule of thugs that we discussed in the Soviet Union.
I think like one of the things here that gets lost is that you really can't do decentralization. I think is a little bit of a red herring, and that's because ultimately what we care about is the on-ramps and the off-ramps for US dollars. And that's always going to be highly, highly regulated. It's going to happen through centralized exchanges. And the reason that like even before this sanctions designated list, even before this, that like exchanges would not accept dollars laundered through Tornado Cash is because like there was this fear that this would happen, right? That eventually like all these other, like everything that the exchange owned would get tainted by some future sanctions actions. And so like, I think like there's only so much you can decentralize, and you'll never be able to decentralize the US on-ramps and off-ramps. The second point I wanted to mention is like, there's a few comments about like, oh, like, why do we care about institutions, right? Like, we're not building this stuff for institutions. And like, institutions ultimately, at the end of the day, like represent or invest on behalf of real people, right? These are firefighters' pensions. These are your 401ks. These are even like the ETFs that you might buy that represent, different stocks. And so, there's only going to be a very limited number of people who are going to own their own execution and open their own, crypto account and there's only so many assets that are going to go through that. The vast majority, if we fast forward 10 years, of assets that are involved in the crypto ecosystem are going to be done through institutions, right? And we saw this BlackRock news just recently, and we've seen a whole bunch of announcements coming down the pipeline. And so like if institutions are going to be involved, they're going to be very, very concerned about ensuring that the money that they manage is not involved in, facilitating terrorist or rogue states actions, right? And so like, again, this is just like, I think a problem that we're going to have to solve if crypto is going to grow beyond sort of the, what it is today, right? And I think, hey, my whole career is involved in crypto, so it seems like it's everything to me. But at the end of the day, like we're talking about a market cap of $1.2 trillion across all coins. That's less than the size of, I think, 4 or 5 different US companies. it's a very, very small, small ecosystem. And if we, I personally think like it's going to be a $20 trillion, it's going to be a $30 trillion business. In order to get there, like you're going to have to get institutions involved, and you're going to have, proper AML, KYT, let's call it, know your own token, on the blockchain for it to survive.
So if I could jump in for a second, I mean, I think Jim, part of the reaction to what you're saying is that I think it goes against the ethos of the space, right? The initial sort of cypherpunk ethos of the space. But I agree with your point that for crypto to really grow and mature, it's going to have to address and deal with these problems. That means at a technical level, right? Like doing what is possible while remaining neutral to prevent illicit use where it is possible without sacrificing on those values that people in crypto hold dear. I think the other side of the coin is to convince the broader public, our legislators, et cetera, that those values are good and important, and to convince them that they also want these technologies to exist, and that they also need them. I wish that we lived in a world where, like to Zuko's point earlier, he stated that our kind of like bottom up freedoms are what give America and other, quote unquote, Western countries our advantage in a lot of ways. I agree with that. I wish we lived in a world where we could kind of lay out those principles and people would go, hey, that makes sense. And yeah, we should let these technologies exist because of that. I'm not sure that's realistic, and I'm not sure that those arguments are going to convince enough of the public. And our lawmakers and whatever to make laws that allow these technologies to exist, even though there will be, to some extent, some quote unquote illicit use of these tools. I think if we want to get people convinced that they need these tools, and at the severe risk of being too cynical here, I think fear is very motivating and very convincing and very persuasive. And to Zuko's earlier point of like wartime versus peacetime, for most of the public, they're in a peacetime mentality. And so they don't see why these tools are valuable. If you live in a different regime, a different place, you might understand that, or you almost certainly understand that much more clearly. Most Americans and Westerners broadly aren't in that mindset. And so, but that doesn't mean that those kinds of bad things don't happen and that these tools aren't valuable to prevent them. And so I think it's fair game to try to get people into that mindset, tap into their fears a little bit, whether those fears are reasonable or not, because there are things to fear, and these tools are important and will be needed.
I've mostly tried to stay out of the way here and just let other people talk and just kind of facilitate. But I think that one nuance that's being missed here, at least from my perspective, is that crypto and blockchain products don't need to mean only one thing. It doesn't need to just be for institutions. It doesn't need to just be a tool for freedom fighters or whoever it is. There can be a spectrum of products that exist. And if there need to be products and playgrounds that exist for institutions to be able to use and leverage the tools that we're building, and I think to John from Aztec's point earlier, if there need to be companies that are putting kind of their commercial interests first and seeking to appeal to whether it's mainstream individuals or, as Jim is speaking to, institutions, then that's fine. That's great. That doesn't mean that we can't also have existing within the crypto ecosystem and existing on blockchains, other products whose goals are totally different, whose goals are not for big institutional players to be using them, but are instead tools of actual freedom. And I think that is a nuance that's being missed here. I think that for many of us who've been in this space for many years, we're used to crypto being a small niche industry, of a few hundred people and of a handful of tools. And we all kind of, I think, came into it from similar ideologies. But we also need to accept that that's not where we are anymore, that we've matured away from that, and that it's okay for there to be different approaches to different things. Where I will disagree with Jim is I think that Jim is suggesting that, it is a healthy move for the industry to be moving in a direction where it's possible to have just code on the sanctions list, because that makes institutionals more comfortable. I think that is probably misguided. But I do think that it's fine for us to be building tools that are geared towards institutions. And on a very personal level, not speaking on behalf of my company or anything here, but like on a personal level, I'm also pretty comfortable with the tools that are for, kind of the freedom fighters and are geared towards censorship resistant to also exist. So I just wanted to throw that in, but opening up the floor to those who want to hop in. I personally would love to hear from Amin. I know, you're someone who's, again, one of the OGs, been building in this space for a very long time, but anyone who wants to jump in here, please.
Hi, Jill. Thanks for the intro. This is Amin. I'm the CEO of SpankChain, and I made Moloch DAO and co-founded the Rye stablecoin. I also gave Tornado their first grant. I remember meeting Alexi, kid that just got arrested, and helping them get excited about building this cool new tool to protect personal privacy. So I feel somewhat remiss and fairly emotional. Yeah, I have a couple things to add. I see a lot of sympathizers for the regulators. Maybe there's a few and I'm just paying more attention to them, but I don't necessarily think we, in any sense of the word, are the good guys. I don't think that's a safe assumption to be able to make over long term. I believe that the currency scam that every country imposes on their citizens is getting called into question. The dollar Ponzi of the last 50 years since we left the gold standard is not American. It is an abomination. We fight wars like we did in Iraq, not because of weapons of mass destruction, those were never found, but instead to prop up the petrodollar. So we fight wars and we lie about it in order to prop up the USD. Our money is blood money and we're addicted to it. None of this is like that crazy. You can see my tweets, there's explanations for all this. But for whatever reason, we think that, we are immune to consequences. I saw Jim Greco's tweet that, you're not, you decentralize something, there's still gonna be consequences. Well, it's like, maybe if the guy that you elected that committed war crimes, or maybe you didn't vote for him, maybe you're still gonna suffer some consequences for it. Maybe the rest of the world is going to see our US dollar Ponzi, and the only way it's going to end is with a war. And maybe if we don't have the political will within our country to end it ourselves, then we're sort of asking for it. And the way I see everything going is that it's every citizen on the planet, every individual person against every government on the planet. Israel just banned cash above $1,500. Every country will go this way. If we want to preserve our access to permissionless or decentralized finance or financial privacy, we have to sue the government to protect ourselves. And we have to design our systems to survive a US sanctions when US citizens suddenly can't interact with these systems at all. This is the inevitable conclusion. Nikolai had a great tweet. It's like, what stops the CIA from using your protocol for terrorism and then accusing you of being a terrorist? Nothing, absolutely nothing. None of our systems are set up for this. And so if we want any chance at being able to use things that are permissionless or decentralized in the inevitable long-term future, we have to fight this today. Fuck Goldman Sachs, fuck JP Morgan, fuck the institutions. They're never relevant anyway. They're just going to prop up the same US dollar Ponzi and fight wars to defend it. So I don't give a shit. Thank you for my time.
Coming in so strong.
Okay.
I love it. Yeah, Zuko,
now we've got
go ahead.
multiple data points outside of the Overton window of this discussion. I was going to say that radical technologies take society decades to ingest and adapt to, and there can be a lot of harm and pain and disruption along the way. The thing I'm most concerned about is existential threats to our whole society. We have rogue states with nukes. We have the very, it's not even a risk anymore. We have not only the risk, but the actuality of the permanent tyranny coming into effect. The tyranny that can never be overthrown or can never decay or can never, resolve itself, reform, can never improve because of this new information technology, which gives the tyrants sort of infinite and permanent control. And we also have this emerging threat of AIs performing more and more effective social control on whole populations. So what I'm interested in is resilience and the ability for humanity to survive and learn and grow. And we need that both at a technological level from encryption and decentralized cooperation. And we also need it at a social level from people being able to disagree and learn and to do their own things, even though they hate and disagree with each other's opinions. So thanks, Jill, for giving us an opportunity for one of those last things right here.
I'll just jump in here too, is that I think that this isn't about bridging the gap. I think that this is about preserving the right to develop technology that protects our online rights. And that means even when it's tough, to invest in the resilience of the technology that we're building, because sure, some people might think that there's inherent regulation that will apply to crypto technology if we want to receive the institutional adoption that will make it relevant. I'm using air quotes. But at the end of the day, the point is that we can't compromise on our online digital rights to develop technology that protects our digital freedom for the reasons that Zuko just laid out, is because, again, this is a drop in the waterfall that will be the way that nation states and institutions wield technology and to enact different forms of social control. And if we aren't preserving our right to develop technology that protects us in those situations as a compromise to regulation, then we are not contributing to a resilient future that we can exist in. And I think it's just at every decision ensuring that that need for resilience is being taken into consideration, because everything will be fighting against it, whether that be regulators or whether that be venture capitalists. And the point isn't, like, Jill, I really love what you said. There's room for everything in the ecosystem. There is room for everything, but that means fighting against actions that try to restrict and ban the right to develop this technology. And I honestly think that that's what we're seeing in the Tornado Cash sanction situation quandary right now. And that's where I disagree with this all-in-all approach that, this is going to happen. And so we got to just find a way around it. We need to find a way around it, but we need to find a way around it that has ideological values embedded in the approach to ensure that we're protecting our digital freedoms. And I'm hoping that this will be a radical turning point for many people who are in this space to recommit to that vision and do it with intention, because, as you said, this is like a longer battle that we have ahead of us.
Hey, I'm Jack Newton. Thanks for hosting this, and thanks for everyone's comments. This is something very near and dear to my heart. Just a little background on me. I worked at Wire for 2.5 years. It's basically, you have used their on-ramp. It's B2B. And so we've dealt with a lot of regulators and all of this that's happening. And I think, at this point, we see the cards that the government is playing, and we see their hand. And I think to talk about solutions and like what we can do to get ahead of this, I actually think we have to front run the regulators and start building compliance that adheres to certain standards of the government, but also maintains privacy for us. I think, I can't remember who was talking about their data center with like a tripwire to basically ghost the data. But, if there's a way, I've been thinking about this, like for basically, I think DeFi front ends could be regulated, right? But what the government is doing by sanctioning smart contracts, I think that's the huge issue here. I think front ends should be regulated to some degree, whether that's a zero knowledge proof. Wire was going to do a yes compliance token. There's a ton of options, but I think there's going to be some type of on-chain compliance. But The real battle that we have to fight here is protecting, our right to build openly and freely. But I have lots of thoughts on, I guess, identity and regulations. And if anyone wants to chat about it, hit me up. But I'll pass it over to Henry.
Yeah, I counterpoint is that, like, for me, the idea that the conclusion from sort of seeing this totally like nuclear option sanctions, and then seeing the arrest of an open source software developer, the idea that the lesson from that is like, oh well, we need to build compliance tools, is really incomprehensible to me. Like, we have all of the, like, if you just think about what it means to build a useful blockchain tool, as part of that, a necessary part of that for it to be useful is somebody has to be able to make their own activity legible to themselves. And so it's just a basic operational requirement of building a private tool. You end up with exactly the accounting information that you would need to hand over to someone to say, look, this is all of my activity, right? In exactly the same way that, like, a company can like turn over their books to an auditor. And Tornado, like, I feel like I'm going insane because Tornado Cash already has that. Like, you can see all of your transaction activity and you can prove that, like, I didn't commingle any of my funds with North Korea, and none of that matters, right? Like, the regulators don't care. They just went and banned everybody, including like totally law-abiding US persons who are now like out, potentially like tens of thousands of dollars or whatever, right? So the idea of like, oh, well, we'll just like imagine what the requirements of a regulator will be, and then we'll like build an like a compliant thing, a compliance tool into our protocol based on our imagined idea of like what a regulator might want, is like, not only, to me is a politically bad move, but it also just seems like a really losing strategy, because the regulator doesn't, like, there is zero evidence that any of the regulators actually care. So why would you beyond building the tools for an individual person to understand what their own activity is and to be able to do accounting so that they can comply with their obligations, right? Like, I can build a list of all my transactions, my trades, I can compute my tax obligation, and then like, send the report over to the IRS. And if they get mad, I have some, documents to demonstrate. The idea of like building in protocol level controls beyond that, in a context where the regulators have already demonstrated that they have no interest in like mitigating collateral damage, just seems bizarre.
I wanna call on Michael to hop in here, because I know Michael and I know that he'll just stay out of the way until someone actually calls on him. And maybe you can, as someone who was at Treasury or the acting director of FinCEN, maybe you can speak to why we as industry should be motivated to be thinking ahead and to be engaging. And not to just throw in the towel here and say, there's no hope.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. I'm happy to jump in. Sorry, there's so many amazing people still in the queue that I'm trying to stay out of the way. But I think it's a lot of great points that Henry brought up, and I think, but I do want to go back to some of what Abby was saying, and Jill, what you were too, about the spectrum of opportunity that we want to be building to out there. Like, there's certainly some really niche command line interface technology out there, but I think we want to be able to build to things that lots of people want, and so that we're and can use, like, functionally use, and not just lose their value, lose your assets, lose your money, that sort of thing, and then be in a position where there's an ability to keep building without this sort of fear of sort of the arrest in Amsterdam, which I don't know any of the details on, so I don't know how related it is, or if it was just pushed forward by the public listing or what it was. So I don't want to speculate on that, but it's, regardless, it's a chilling effect and it's scary, and I'm a little like, we want to have the spectrum, I think, of strongly resilient technology. That's the whole point of this, and that's a security for every individual. That's why we have encryption, and we've had encryption. And to some degree, as many people have said, this decision's been made that encryption is legal, and it has to be legal because we need to be preventing victims, not just chasing afterwards. And that's the point. But we also want to have a spectrum of options and the ability to build. And I think to do that, yes, we can just go completely decentralized as fast as possible. But you see with the arrest, like the people can be found, and we shouldn't get into that posture as much as we possibly can, other than authoritarian regimes. And to do that, I think it is getting some alignment with governments around the world and educating them. And certainly they have an obligation to be more engaged in learning. I think the SEC has recently been a lot tougher to deal with on that, but at least from a FinCEN perspective, we were absolutely clear in 2019, like anonymizing software is not an MSB. It's not an AML issue. Like, we do not regulate you, period. That's software and that's developers. And I think so I want to also not treat regulators monolithically in the same way that we don't treat industry as like every industry is Celsius or Goldman Sachs or whatever it is. I think it's getting that spectrum of nuance for everybody out there and educating on that. And then also building things that just lots of people can use and want for whatever their spectrum of comfort is. Like, I think some people they're under an authoritarian regime and need absolute hard-coded, very difficult to use but difficult to break stuff, and having people that it's more of an iPod and there's an option for lots of people to do that. And then you're bringing people along and creating technology that legislators that want to get elected can't be trying to crush if they want to get elected. Like, I think we need the resilience because you can't trust that every system is going to work, and a lot of them are frankly not working right now. But it can't just be battle mode. Like, it's battle mode in the planning, but it can't be battle mode in the subsistence long term.
Just going to jump in and add something about the law and holding it in high regard. Slavery was legal. The Holocaust was legal. If you were a good rule-following citizen, you would have recommended that slaves not run away. If you were a good law-abiding German citizen, you would have helped direct Jews to the most close concentration camp. There are times that laws go poorly, and the only defense is people breaking them. And a lot of lives get destroyed in the process, and we call this progress. It's an aspect of moral entrepreneurship. You breaking stale laws is a public good. Unfortunately, we don't reward people for it. We punish them all the same. But to be absolutely clear, I'm not advocating for any U.S. citizens to break any laws regarding tornado and sanctions and all that. We saw how that went with Virgil. Still in jail. He's going to be in jail for a while. That said, I don't see any other ways that this solves, because the people who think that we're going to argue with the government to get privacy in our financial system are hopeless. That is a futile effort. They will mandate that we have to put a backdoor in every privacy system. And if they haven't yet, it's because no one uses it.
No, I think
I disagree.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Just the last detail that it's hopeless. I really disagree.
If North Korea put $400 million into Zcash, it would be banned tomorrow. Don't give me that shit.
I definitely agree that it's hopeless in China currently. I don't think it's hopeless in the United States. I think we do have rule of law. We do have the Constitution, or at least the First and Fourth Amendments. I think those might be the only two amendments left standing. But anyway, and the legal experts who've spoken in this conversation really, if you listen to the details they know in many cases, because they were previously on the government side of it, there's the interpretation that the sanctions and the arrest are just the government wants to ban privacy. I don't think that's necessarily accurate. It could be true. It's true in China, or it could become true in the future. But I don't necessarily think that's the way it's going to go in the United States. What Alex said earlier is that freedom and innovation are not only American advantages, but they're also American values.
I haven't seen a single CBDC report that suggests putting privacy and actual anonymity into any sort of financial system. All I've seen is more and more cash getting banned. With the notion that it's, like used by criminals. And when I saw that Zcash, not Zcash, the coin, electric coin company, which you were the CEO of, the statement that you guys put out after Tornado is basically like distancing yourself from this entire thing, saying, we're goody two-shoes. Nobody uses Zcash for illicit anything. And that just seemed like the weakest possible response, because the second anybody does use Zcash for anything provably illicit, you're in the exact same boat as Tornado. So welcome to the party.
If anybody wants to see the statement we put out, it's on electriccoin.co.
I also think that, look, I think that we're starting to talk about this here in this conversation and with pretty blunt tools as opposed to getting into the nuance. And so I just want to encourage a little bit more nuance here in this, because I think that, again, I'll go back to something that John Woo from Aztec brought up earlier, which is that they're ideological incentives and motivations that we all may have. And then there are also commercial incentives and motivations that we have to be real now exist within this industry, right? And I think that it's naive to try to think that we can go back to just being this sort of ideologically driven, band of sort of neo cypherpunks, right? The industry has moved past that. We are in a place that's beyond that. And personally, I think that it's fine for there to be a diversity of incentives, both commercial and ideological, that can coexist, all leveraging and using this technology. I don't think that it's that black and white. I would like to hear from, again, some of the legal folks on stage here, maybe on some of the implications of this, and what maybe for those who are more kind of ideologically driven and less interested with what I'm now going to call the Jim Greco approach of collaborating and working with institutions and being a little bit more friendly on that front. What can be done? What are the actionable things that we can do to engage government, engage policymakers to make sure that the right stories are being told here to protect, again, what I, on a personal level, will characterize as kind of freedom-preserving technologies.
Yeah, can I just jump in really quickly, Jill, and then I want to turn it over because there's a lot of other folks. But I think we're more aligned than it may seem. Like, I'm not suggesting people go along with slavery laws or anything. I'm just suggesting that we do need to fight these in the legal context, not just technologically. It's got to be both, to get the slavery laws overturned or whatever it is. If the people fighting the early encryption debates had just said, well, like, fuck it, let's just give up. Like, it's the government, let's just all get in bunkers. Like, we would have lost a lot of innovation and a lot of opportunity for people to build things like Zcash or whatever. So I think and this ties in with Jill's comment. Like, I think we have to do both. We have to do both.
I agree. I guess the nuance, I'm struggling to understand the nuance, because I don't see a space in between. On the one hand, decentralized ZK systems that preserve anonymity, and on the other hand, ZK systems with a backdoor. There's no middle ground there. Like, if you want anonymity, you either get full anonymity or somebody has a backdoor. The governments will mandate that we have to put a backdoor in every system or they will ban it. So if we want actual decentralization, privacy, permissionless finance, whatever, we have to fight now to defend this here, because this is where it is. This is, it's the game, right? Will someone use a piece of software that you made for some illicit purpose? Can you still use it after they do so? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's more nuance. Happy to hear from other people. Not trying to crowd out discussion, but I don't see it.
Man, I've talked way too much, but go ahead, Michael.
Oh, no, go ahead, Zuko, please.
I've talked way too much, but Crypto Wars 1 veteran reporting in for duty, sir. I was a mere foot soldier in Crypto Wars 1 in the 1990s, but all three of the actions were taken by the good guys. One was civil disobedience and making tools that people could use in defiance of bad laws. One was policy argument and persuasion and making society aware of what was going on. And the third was commercial expansion, which might have been one of the most powerful reasons why we got cryptography, which is why we got the internet starting in the 1990s. If the good guys hadn't won that policy battle, then we'd be living in a very, very different and much worse world in which we never had the internet.
Yeah, I mean, just take a look at like the list of legal victories by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, like policy and litigation, and challenging the government in a legal standing point is just as important as developing the technology that one could use to circumvent or fight against. And we really can't discount all of that work. And I think it's more important than ever to support everything from all fronts.
Yeah, we made donations to Coin Center and stuff too. Like we're doing all that. I don't see arguing with the government as like, I mean, we have to do it.
I think that people have argued with the government and has made many incremental progress towards securing human freedom. And while it's not as maybe radical as you believe that we need to be, and I agree with you,
I'm not going to keep my friends out of jail.
It actually does keep people out of jail. The EFF
not
was
yet.
instrumental in getting
Haven't had much to say.
the Tor developer out of jail after being wrongly imprisoned for running a Tor node. So it does. And it's about doing that while also developing the radical technologies. It's just,
we are so rich now that we just buy into all of this crap and like preserve our lofty positions. We're like, we are mature crypto enthusiasts now. Not the renegade, cypherpunks we once were. I get it. Yes. Put on the suit, go to court.
If I can just briefly jump in, one thing I've been thinking about, a question the industry should ask themselves is, can we survive on our own? As in, if we're going to have to fight all these battles, whether it's through the legal process or whatnot, is it enough for the industry to do it by itself without broader buy-in? And I think that gets to Zuko's point about the importance of commercialization and successful commercialization, because that can change and inform the policy argument, which public policy considerations are something, that judges and regulators and everyone, who carry a big stick do take into consideration. They're not dispositive, but, there's a broader kind of culture war, if you want to call it that, or cultural buy-in that needs to occur at a societal level, I think, to, further guarantee the industry's survival.
Yeah, I agree, Nelson. And to Zuko's point, which I think is responding to Amin's, which is that it's got to be a multi-prong attack. It can't just be, we're just going to opt out of the system because the system's happening. But I'm not saying we should opt into the system. It's everything. It's fighting it in court, fighting by creating the technology that makes it difficult, that makes governments have to come and ask. And it's also finding ways to have technology that works for various people in different ways, whether it's selective disclosure or zero knowledge, that's not backdoors, and finding ways that aren't backdoors. Because there are some people that don't want to transact their house on a cash in a bag sometimes for counterparty risk that has nothing to do with regulation. So it's just giving people optionality of it. But I agree. I mean, it's not about putting on a suit and just opting in. It's got to be a multi-pronged attack, including things that everybody wants to use and in different ways, so that the people that make the laws in the Congress are also feeling it too. I just think it's got to be everything that Zuko laid out that happened in the Encryption Wars 1 that need to be tapped into again this time. And when they overstep, like I think they did with this latest designation, it's fighting it in court, or if it has to go to that. And I think CoinSetter is ready to do that if need be. But I think there's some engagement that can happen faster than that, hopefully as well. But I agree, it's constant vigilance.
I want to try to make a case for incrementalism, which, because DKs are so powerful, you can imagine something like a KYC membership tree where you do third-party KYC, you get placed into an encrypted tree, you then have to furnish proof of membership to that tree to interact with a network. Within the network, you have full transaction graph privacy. And then when you leave, you are definitionally a member of this like KYC entry pool. Now, number one, I know for a fact there are many people in this space who hate that idea, and they fall on opposite ends of the spectrum. People who are compliance first hate that idea because you don't get any transaction graph visibility, and people who are completely pro self-sovereignty hate that idea because it requires KYC. On the other hand, I can easily make the case that that makes the world incrementally a better place. Everyone who wants to use crypto and its powerful, potential, then get transaction graph privacy, or at least within this KYC subset. And I would say that 95+% of crypto users belong to that subset anyway. I mean, how many people do I know deposit into crypto without using a KYC on and off ramp? I hesitate to name more than a couple folks. And so I think there's a clear argument to be made that if we want this utility to expand to a large number of people, that some of these compromises have to be considered.
I wanted to see if others in the audience had things that they wanted to ask of the people who have been talking. I'd be happy to pull some more people up on stage. It's been honestly overwhelming, the number of requests. So I'm sorry if you have requests and I haven't gotten it to you yet, but I'll go through and start to pull some people up. Ben, you just came on stage. I know you've been pinging me, texting me in the background, wanting to make a couple of points. So I want to
that's okay. I've really enjoyed listening, and I'm very grateful for all the perspectives that everyone has been sharing. I'm Ben Fish. I'm the CEO of Espresso Systems, and really thank everyone for coming to participate in the discussion today. So I didn't really want to interrupt, but I would just want to add the perspective, and I think this has already been echoed by what people have said already, but there is value in creating technology that has the ability to protect freedom where sorely needed. But as we see in the Tornado Cash example, regulators can still make rules around how people interact with those technologies. And so there is value by definition, right, in working with them to drive a balanced approach. I really like the incremental improvement perspective that was just shared. And to convince legislators, it's not only important to emphasize our values, but to understand their goals. This kind of situation is often best solved by understanding the intentions and goals on either side. And we can understand the intention of a government sanctioning a pool of money that has been tainted by bad money, say money from the US perspective, right? If Tornado Cash has a deposit from North Korea or somewhere else, right? It's now a tainted pool from their perspective. And we can understand that. And that banning the Tornado Cash contract address may be necessary for the goal of preventing those bad actors from taking their money out. And it doesn't need to be banning the code or the software behind it. It's a specific pool of money. And despite the fact that Tornado Cash has compliance tools, those don't necessarily help for the goal, right? You have to understand what the goal is. And then that also gives you a basis and a foundation for going to the government and pointing out things that they're doing, like shutting down GitHub repos or arresting developers that take things too far and not only infringe on freedoms, but don't at all help with those goals. And so once you establish that basis, there can be a path forward, such as, for example, creating exceptions for people to withdraw from Tornado Cash if they can prove that they're not the target of sanctions. We have the tools. We have zero knowledge proofs and things like that would enable people to do that without revealing their identity. And that's not a backdoor.
I think we need to be very clear that this is a war on crypto. It's not a war on foreign enemies, because you can prove as a US citizen that you didn't use the tech for illicit activities. It's our freedom and our privacy that's under attack. And when criminals use tools for illicit activity, you don't make the tools illegal. We don't make cash illegal because people use it for illegal things. We don't make cars illegal because they're used as gateway vehicles. And we shouldn't be making blockchain privacy tools illegal because hackers use them. It's unconstitutional and undemocratic. And we do have a right to free speech and privacy. And not to mention, it's very impractical, right? Like you can send money to anyone and then you can be associated with this. And so for me, there does need to be a lawsuit, and we as the industry, we need to show damages. And there are over 700 people listening today. Thank you all for listening. And if you haven't if you haven't donated to Coin Center, please do so. And I would love to kind of shift this conversation to talk about those specific calls to action we can all take now.
So I think there are a lot of like restrictions on the use of cash in the ecosystem. For example,
Sorry,
you
Jim, with
can't.
all due respect, last time Elena came in asking for a call to action, you also avoided that possibility. So I'd love to hear from someone else in terms of what the calls to action can be.
I mean, if you want to shut down the conversation, that's fine.
Maybe I can contribute a few points. I've been listening to for a while now and appreciate everybody here on stage sharing their impressions. We're all obviously shocked by the events, and it feels really like a new era is starting and how we define the relationship between this community and governments. I just want to share my perspective a little bit. I'm a lawyer in the space since 2014. I know a lot of the people on stage, met them or other people. And I think one important question to ask with Tornado specifically and software like it, I guess, is there a legitimate dual use case? So can it be argued that it's as much a legitimate software for privacy preserving purposes as much as it can, unfortunately, also be used for illegitimate purposes? And this exact question of dual use, we know it from copyright since 20 years. And so software for ripping DVDs, for example, has long been controversial because, well, if you actually, in certain countries, you're allowed to make a digital copy of a DVD that you bought. In other countries, you can't, and so countries dealt with it differently. When it comes to money laundering, I think it touches one of the most sensitive aspects of where governments are active. And so I expect it to be a really hard fight in courts to make this argument. I do think that even if we don't win this fight, which of course I hope we will win, but if we don't, there should still not be arrests of open source developers, obviously, based on charges we don't even know at this point, but it should actually, there should be an orderly takedown procedure for protocols that clearly violate some rule that, unfortunately we have to accept is currently there. And then, only if this orderly takedown procedure is, continuously violated, maybe governments have to think about arrests, but it cannot be done in a way where suddenly you're being held hostage almost by a government. That seems ridiculous. I just want to also pinpoint something that is not as drastic, but going to be almost or even more, impactful in terms of regulation that is upcoming. To me, it's this question whether is decentralized governance of protocols real, or will governments pretend that they are the same as centralized entities, that actually a form of governing something decentralized as infrastructure, is it a real thing or not? And we currently are not, at least in Europe, where I'm active with the European Crypto Initiative. It's not completely clear that actually the EU will accept that decentralized services are fundamentally different than centralized services. And I think a point of action for everybody here could be to understand what can we do to actually improve and really decentralize the governance systems behind, be it blockchains or be it protocols on blockchains, be it DeFi services or whatever it is. If this is not really there, we have to expect that in the next few years, it will be regulated completely like centralized financial infrastructure. And this will have an even broader impact on many people building code in this space. And just maybe one last, it just hasn't been mentioned while I was in this space, is the role of the Financial Action Task Force. Because a lot of the, I would say, bad policies that we see both in Europe but outside also are actually transpositions of recommendations made by the FATF, which is a non-democratic sort of weird collective that makes these recommendations. And I think this is also a point of action for this space with the amazing network and influence that many people have in here, is to try to create pressure to make whatever the FATF does much more transparent and accountable, because this is where the origin of a lot of these policies actually are. This is where we need to start to get active as well. So interested to hear people react to this. Thank you.
Yeah, just jump in with reactions, please.
I kind of wanted to, thanks for hosting this, by the way, Jill. This is an awesome space. I definitely wanted to go back to something Tegan hit on. I think she's spot on. It's a war on crypto. Ben from Espresso basically said we need to understand the goals behind people who make these sorts of decisions and take these actions. And I don't necessarily disagree, but I guess my question, somewhat rhetorically, is like, what's the goal? Like limiting criminal behavior? That's possible without the actions that were taken. So maybe the goal is general compliance. Well, with this specific example of Tornado Cash, those tools already exist. So again, like recent actions were totally unnecessary. And I agree with almost everything Henry and Amin have been saying. Like over hostile reactions, these sort of overreaches from us or from the industry aren't necessarily the winningest strategy. But I mean, I'd sort of advocate they definitely have their place. And I think the value of the industry posture that seems to be strongly advocated here of just listen and learn is, in my opinion, significantly overplayed, since everyone we should be listening to has shown minimal interest at best to, listening and learning from us. Now, having said that, Michael's point that like monolithically categorizing regulators is definitely sort of an inaccurate characterization. But speaking in broad strokes, like these regulators have not shown much interest in constructive dialogue, and those that have are notable because they're exceptions. So it's definitely a war on crypto. Like understanding the goal is important, but no matter how you slice it, in my perspective, the goal isn't really easily discernible and doesn't sort of have any logical framing. I'll just end it there. Those are my reactions.
I'm curious as to why people think that regulators haven't been responsive, haven't been engaging in the process, because that's actually not at all what we've seen from the New York Department of Financial Services, which was very early on with the BIT license. That's not what we've seen from the SEC and the CFTC, the CFTC in particular, which claimed Bitcoin and Ethereum for its own. And so I actually think that regulators have been very, have been very engaged on this because of how important this is to the population. And I think that some of the points that John Woo came up with and about incrementalism is very, very valid here, right?
At least my interpretation of a lot of the conversation here is not that we think as an industry that regulators aren't engaging, but that regulators are maybe engaging in a haphazard, non-uniform way that might come down to even the political ambitions of the individuals involved in these offices. And I think that it's that feeling that this may be political in nature as opposed to a question of sort of, regulating in a way that is working within existing frameworks around rights, constitutional rights, prior precedent and so forth. I think that's the problem that I think many of us are trying to speak to. And then also I would add to that actually just the lack of clarity in general, right? The fact that, based on the arrest today, based on, this action, just in terms of the unprecedented nature of putting a smart contract on an SDN list, the fact that this has just software developers like living in fear. Like I can tell you, even like within our own company, like there's real fear amongst people about what the implications of this might be. That's the problem. It's not a problem of like, oh, regulators aren't paying any attention to us. It's the lack of clarity and also, again, the haphazard kind of way of going about this. I am going to end the space at 2 p.m., but I hope that there's demand to do this again and to have more conversations like this. I know that I would be happy to participate. I think that we can get Michael to come back and host. And I want to let a few more voices jump in here in the last 15 minutes or so. So I'll get out of the way again. But thank you again to everyone.
I would love to jump in. My name's Chris Boscolo. I'm actually a builder in this space, and building privacy, enhancing communication is like core to what we're doing. And I want to talk a little bit about actually a word that Zuko mentioned maybe 25 minutes ago, which is an Overton window. And there was a question about what's our call to action. And I think one of our calls to action for everybody should be to promote privacy preserving technology as normal, because I was a builder back in the 90s when it was, we had to actually ship encryption software with 56-bit keys overseas because it was deemed a munition. And today, like, we would laugh at that, right? The whole world sees encryption software as just totally normal. And that part of that is the shift in perspective of people that people have towards the technology, because people like us talk about it and its uses outside of criminal use cases. In the 90s, encryption technology was only used by terrorists. Now it's used by everybody in the world. So I'm hoping that in 2030, everybody's using Zcash because it's normal, not because they're trying to funnel money to North Korea. So that's my call to action for this group.
So I just want to say something as someone that was born in Iran and raised in Canada. I'm working in crypto. These fears of sanction are something not new to me. It's been going on for since before I was born. And I want to say when the committee talks about the KYC on the gateways, so we should consider that KYC is the Western thing, and more than 25 countries are in the gray list. So, and also any other international students, I know many Iranian international students in Canada, which are working here, living here, but because their only valid ID is an Iranian passport, they get rejected from KYC right away. So you're taking out all those people from any protocol that you want to implement a KYC on. And also KYC is know your customers. They are not your customers. They're the protocol users. And they should not be considered the same as PayPal's users. I just want to put this out there because KYC being thrown out here and there as a solution, but it's a Western solution. It's not a global solution. And we're trying to remove the physical borders and have a global digital nation. Just want to add that.
Nate, I see you've been raising your hand wanting to speak here for a while. I'll let you jump in.
Thanks, Jill. And I really appreciate you hosting this. This has been a phenomenal call. I wanted to speak to Tegan's call to action. I see 3 general ways forward. There's the rollover and let the regulators do what they want and force us to change what we're doing in the crypto space. Then there's the try to, I think then there's the most important one I want to talk about is the way we move forward without giving anything to them. I think the second way is the legal route. We try to fight it with policy think tanks like Coin Center and try to fight on their terms. But I think the third way is doing it in the face of attack. And I use these strong words because I think that's really what we're looking at. This is the crypto wars 2.0. And I think the only way to fight this battle is to create strong systems with very robust incentives. And so we've been starting to describe that as tokenomics. That's what I do. I build tokenomics frameworks specifically for hyperstructures, these protocols that we want to deploy and have exist forever. We want blockchain applications to outlast us. And to do that, they have to have strong enough security. They have to have incentives built in the protocol to not only keep the protocol running and reward investors of the protocol, but to reward users of that protocol. And so I think the third way to the call to action that I would make is for us to start considering how these systems operate without us. And to me, that is the essence of tokenomics, is the alignment of incentives between users, investors, all participants in a protocol, such that these protocols will continue to exist without human input. I think that's really the only way forward for us as crypto if we want to go into this with as much force as we possibly can.
Yeah, Jill, this is David McCarl. Just to follow up on that last point, I think that is definitely one path going forward for devs, but I think that is actually the reality for Tornado Cash, as it is still in use. It's still available for people to use. But as an entity, they have no standing to argue in court that there are constitutional rights here at risk, and they don't have any standing to come in and argue that freedom and privacy are American values. They don't have any ability to say that, look, attorney-client confidentiality, privileged information, limited liability, corporate shields, First and Fourth Amendment rights, these are all things that should protect us from being shut down. And the other thing is they don't have the ability to talk about some of the facts that are out there that show that cryptocurrency transactions are by far cleaner than traditional finance when it comes to money laundering. And I think, these avenues are shut down for devs and programmers who are working on privacy tech if they don't have a US entity that can come in and argue for them. So I think the call to action that I would put forward to people is prepare to legally defend yourself and your devs, or go full anon degen and just recognize that you're not going to have any chance to argue in court. But thank you very much for this space. It's been great listening. Thank you.
Thanks so much to all of you, and the thanks for this space really goes to the speakers and all involved and all fighting for this, and on behalf of the crypto community, even those who are kind of bringing a more institutional perspective. I think it's important to remember are fighting on behalf of the crypto and blockchain space as a whole. And so again, really credit goes to everyone here, both on the stage and in the audience. Just in the last few minutes here, I know, Michael, you had some thoughts again on kind of the actionable takeaways here. I want to pass it back to you before we wrap this up. And I'm going to go spend the next several hours trying to figure out if I can recover this as a recording so that we can, share all of the takeaways and the conversations, because I really think that it has been productive. And again, I really hope that all of you, both in the audience and on stage and who participated in many different ways, will be up for doing this again in the future. So with that, Michael, over to you.
Thanks to everybody for jumping in, and particularly for challenging each other, because I do think that's how we get to a better spot on this. And I appreciate everybody with opposing viewpoints like really speaking up and not just being an echo chamber the whole time, because we need to create our own resilient system around all of this. And I think to some of that, from my perspective, there's been a lot of different opinions about how best to do it. And I think it's a mix of us aligning, but also people working to their strengths. So, folks Nate talking about building resilient and incentivized systems, like, go for it. And I think it's going to, in the end, be like Zuko's encryption war 1, where it's got to be a multi-prong approach, but not everybody has to do every prong. So, I'm committed on the legal perspective and working with Coin Center and Blockchain Association and Crypto Council for Innovation and everybody else, DeFi Education Fund. Miller's doing some incredible work educating and aligning people from a pure DeFi perspective, which is so important. So I think, it's educating regulators. And if you don't agree with that, then that's not a good use of your time. And others of us will work on that because I just think there's too much at stake here for the resilience of our rights. And so many people fought so hard in the first encryption wars to make sure that there was an ability to have privacy and security and to find some sort of dynamic tension that's probably going to be forever. But the tension only remains if we keep pulling in appropriate ways. So from here, I think I'd love to continue the conversation when folks can in whatever way. But I'm here and very reachable and happy to help on legal, including so people aren't over complying, or if they're fighting in court, overreaches, anything like that. Just to aid the system, not looking for clients. And I know there's a lot of other people are too. So I just encourage people to all be in touch, and Jill or whoever else keeps this going would be wonderful, but please stay engaged on it, certainly beyond the Twitter space. And thanks to everybody.
Thanks so much, Michael. And yeah, someone brought up earlier, what happens when the Twitter spaces end? Well, first and foremost, let's not let the conversation drop. We're already talking about trying to host another one of these maybe next week. This is an ongoing issue. This is not over today. This isn't even over when the dust settles on Tornado Cash. This is an ongoing conversation that we, as an industry, as a community, and as a society, need to have. So if you enjoyed this, or if you want to be involved in the next one, if you were involved in this one and want to participate again, please ping me, DM me on Twitter, email me if you have that information, and we'll keep making the conversation happen. So thank you again to everyone who took time out to listen today, to participate. Let's keep the conversation going. And thank you especially to Michael. I know he's trying to pretend like this was my space, but again, really, this wouldn't have happened without him, and he's the true host here. So thank you all. Go keep fighting the good fight, and we'll see you next time.